Welcome, to the Cursed Hour, where every whisper in the dark, every creak in the floor, might be something watching threes. If you found this channel, you're already part of the curse. The House of Hollow Omens. The house stood pristine in Virginia's wealthiest neighborhood. But the moment I stepped out of my patrol car, a chill gripped me. I immediately had an uneasy feeling about the house. Well, nice on the outside, it just had bad energy surrounding it. Empty energy drink cans littered the porch, a Ouija board glaring from the table. Inside, a family was shattered, and in the basement, a girl named Emily hung lifeless. Something in that house wasn't just wrong, it was alive, and it wasn't done with us. I thought I'd seen it all as a cop, but nothing prepared me for that house. Everything about this house just felt off and wrong. The air was thick, the shadows too heavy, and a Ouija board sat like a warning on the patio. Down in the basement, Emily's body swayed from a rafter, her obsession with a dead boyfriend pulling her into the dark. 2 weeks later, her parents were gone too. Was it a curse? Or did she summon something unstoppable? The call came on a quiet night, but the house screamed danger before I even crossed the threshold. The scene in the basement was similar to the front porch, though energy drink cans were everywhere, and another Ouija board was on a small coffee table. Emily, just 19, had ended her life, driven by voices from a Ouija board. Then her family followed, one tragedy after another. I don't know what you guys think, but to me it definitely seems like either that house is cursed. I still feel its shadow. As a cop, you learn to ignore bad vibes, but that house wouldn't let me. This is a call that really messed me for a while. The basement where Emily died was a shrine to her obsession. Cans, a Ouija board, and a darkness that clung to my skin. Her family's deaths followed like clockwork, each more brutal than the last. It was the same house that the doctor lived in. Did its walls trap something evil? Or did we just fail to stop it? I've faced death before, but nothing like that house in Virginia. I had a very uneasy and sick feeling being in that basement, and not because of the dead body. Emily's suicide was just the beginning. Her parents' car crash, her sister's accident, all tied to that cursed address. Ouija boards kept appearing, even years later, on my new street. I usually use a stick or something to push them into the storm drain, but coincidence, I'm not so sure. Something followed me, and it's still out there. I used to be a police officer in a city in Virginia. There is one upscale neighborhood in our city with very nice homes. The houses gleamed with manicured lawns and iron gates, but one stood out for all the wrong reasons. I was always told stories when I was a new officer that there was a doctor who used to live in one of those homes. The tale was grim. The story goes that the doctor attempted to perform some type of operation on himself. He numbed his stomach area to make an incision on himself. But since he couldn't feel it, he accidentally cut too far and too deep. They found him barely alive, clutching his own insides, a grotesque end to a brilliant mind. When officers and paramedics arrived, he was barely alive, holding his own intestines, and ultimately died. Years later, I was called to that same address. I was assigned a call about a young female who was found dead by her older sister. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but the moment I pulled up, I immediately had an uneasy feeling about the house. Well, nice on the outside, it just had bad energy surrounding it. The mansion's white columns and rose bushes should have been inviting, but they felt like a mask. As I approached the front porch, I noticed countless empty energy drink cans and a Ouija board on the front patio table. The cans were scattered like offerings, the Ouija board a silent warning. Everything about this house just felt off and wrong. Inside, the family was in pieces, sobs echoing through the high-ceilinged foyer. The family was obviously very distraught. They led me to the basement, where Emily, the 19-year-old daughter, had been found. I was told that the deceased sister, her name was Emily, was in the basement. Another officer arrived, staying upstairs to comfort the parents and older sister. I descended alone, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was unfinished and was fairly dark, minus 2 pool string light bulbs, one on each side of the basement. The dim glow revealed a chaotic scene. The scene in the basement was similar to the front porch, though energy drink cans were everywhere, and another Ouija board was on a small coffee table. Emily's body hung from a rafter, an exercise band around her neck. Emily, who was 19 if I remember correctly, was hanging by her neck on a basement rafter. She had unfortunately ended her own life with an exercise band and was swinging back and forth slightly. It was a gut-wrenching sight, her slight frame swaying in the shadows. It was a horrible sight, and another officer helped me lift her to bring her down. We worked in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down. I had a very uneasy and sick feeling being in that basement, and not because of the dead body. The house itself seemed to pulse with malice, a presence I couldn't name. Emily's family consisted of her mother and father, and her older sister. Upstairs, her parents were inconsolable, their faces pale with shock. Her parents stated that they had been trying to help her because all she ever did was drink energy drinks to stay up all hours of the night playing on the Ouija board. Emily's older sister, Claire, pulled me aside, her voice trembling. Her older sister said that Emily indeed had been obsessed with the Ouija board, drinking energy drinks to stay up all night, and talked to what she believed was her boyfriend, who was dead. Claire and Emily were close, sharing secrets like only sisters do. They stated that they were very close and told each other everything pretty much. Claire revealed that Emily had been saying that her boyfriend was begging for her to come join him in the afterlife, and so she believed that this is why she did what she did. This is a call that really messed me for a while. I'd seen death before, car accidents, overdoses, but this was different. Let me reiterate, this house felt wrong. Everything felt bad. The Ouija boards, the cans, the oppressive air, it all pointed to something beyond grief. It definitely wasn't my first. As cops, we're trained to move on, to file the report and take the next call. But this one clung to me, a shadow I couldn't shake. We found no clear answers, no note from Emily, just the eerie sense that the house itself had played a role. 2 weeks later, I was back on duty when a call came in. A car accident with ejection. 2 weeks later to the day I get a call about a car accident with ejection. I race to the scene, lights flashing, sirens blaring. I head to the call code 1 lights and sirens and arrive to find a convertible BMW with the top down, which had experienced an obvious horrible crash and rollover. The car was a wreck, flipped on its side. In the driver's seat was a woman who clearly had a broken neck, as her head was almost all the way turned around. Nearby, a man lay 25 feet away, thrown from the open top. Next to the vehicle, about 25 feet away though, was a man who had been ejected. Keep in mind, this was a convertible, so he was ejected from the top of the car. The scene was chaos, blood and debris scattered across the road. I went to close off the scene with some yellow tape. I walked about 80 yards away from the accident, where I found yet another chunk of the guy. The violence of the crash was staggering. Checking the man's ID, my heart sank. Upon obtaining the man's ID, I read the information off to the dispatch, and then another officer. And I both realized the same thing. At the same time, these two people. They were Emily's parents, who 2 weeks to the day just died in a horrible way. The woman was Emily's mother, the man her father. I tell you that breaking the news to the older sister was absolutely heartbreaking. Claire, Emily's sister, was now alone, inheriting a fractured life. I kept in touch with her for a little while after this. She sold the house, the life insurance money, funding a fresh start. She had inherited her parents' estate and all of the life insurance money, etc. She ended up selling off everything and buying a different house to try and start over and repair her broke life. I checked in on her, hoping she'd find peace, but the house's shadow lingered. Around a month later, another officer was called after a pedestrian was struck by a car while she was jogging in her neighborhood. And yes, you guessed it, it was the sister. Claire was hit while jogging, her body broken on the pavement. She managed to survive several weeks in a coma, but ultimately she just didn't make it. The news gutted me. An entire family, gone in weeks, all tied to that cursed address. If you're wondering why the story about the doctor is relevant, it's because the house that Emily killed herself in was the same house that the doctor lived in. The doctor's gruesome end, Emily's obsession, her parents' crash, Claire's accident. It felt like more than coincidence. I don't know what you guys think, but to me it definitely seems like either that house is cursed or Emily opened up something really bad. I started questioning everything. Had Emily's Ouija board sessions unleashed something? Or was the house itself a trap, claiming anyone who lingered? I left the force not long after, needing distance from the memories. That was all. A few years ago now, and I'm no longer a police officer. I moved a couple of states away. I settled in a quiet town, hoping to leave Virginia behind. But the past followed. Twice now, I found 2 different Ouija board plets on the sidewalk when going to check my mail. They appeared outside my apartment, small and weathered, like relics of that basement. I never touched them, obviously, and usually use a stick or something to push them into the storm drain. But coincidence, I'm not so sure. Each time, I felt that same sickening dread, as if the house's reach extended across states. I searched X for similar stories, finding whispers of cursed homes and Ouija board hauntings. Some spoke of spirits, others of psychological traps. I don't know what's true, but I know that house wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was a void, swallowing lives one by one. I still see Emily's face, Claire's tears, the twisted metal of that BMW, and I wonder if whatever claimed them is still out there, waiting for its next guest. The house on that pristine street haunts my dreams. I've tried to rationalize it. Grief, coincidence, a cop's overworked mind, but the pieces don't fit. The doctor's self-inflicted end, Emily's descent, her family's rapid erasure. It's a pattern too precise for chance. I've read about cursed places, buildings that hold on to pain like a sponge. That house felt alive, its walls watching, its air heavy with intent. Emily's Ouija board obsession wasn't just a teen's delusion. It was a key, unlocking something that should have stayed buried. Claire's death was the final blow. After the accident, I visited her in the hospital, her body wired to machines, her face peaceful yet empty. I sat by her bedside, whispering apologies for not protecting her family. When she passed, I felt the house's shadow deepen. I quit the force, moved away. But the Ouija board pieces keep appearing. I've found 3 now, each one closer to my door. I've never opened one, never touched them, but their presence feels like a message. Is it the house, Emily's boyfriend, or something older, tied to the doctor's blood-soaked end? I avoid that Virginia town now, but I check X for news, half expecting another tragedy tied to that address. The new owners, if there are any, might not know its history. I want to warn them. But what would I say? That a house can kill? That a Ouija board can summon more than spirits? I live quietly now, but every creak in my apartment, every shadow, brings that basement back. The house of hollow omens didn't just take a family. It took a piece of me, and I'm not sure I'll ever get it back. The path that stole my soul. I grew up in a fairly rural area of Virginia. The land was wide and wild, a patchwork of fields and forests where a kid could lose himself. As a kid, I had an obsession for dirt bikes. The roar of engines, the thrill of motocross on TV, the glossy pages of Racer X magazines. They consumed me. When my mom and dad bought me my first dirt bike one Christmas, I was ecstatic. That bike was my freedom, my wings. Right behind my parents' house was a huge expanse of woods. Those trees held my world, a kingdom of trails waiting to be conquered. But what if the woods had secrets they weren't ready to share? There was a trail that ran virtually the entire length of our neighborhood. It was my domain, a single, winding path carved through the forest, dotted with turns and jumps. It would take about 15 minutes on my dirt bike to ride the length of the trail from end to end. I'd race from one end to the other, then turn back. The rhythm of it as natural as breathing. There were no other trails to just this one long trail. I knew every route, every rut, every twist by heart. But how could a path I knew so well hide something so impossible? I started having this reoccurring dream, night after night. I'd see myself speeding down that trail, the wind in my face, the bike's hum steady. Suddenly, there would be a new intersection, a brand new trail to go down. It wasn't there in waking life, but in the dream. It called to me, a path untouched and waiting. I would ride down it and come to a large clearing in the woods. The clearing was vast, circular, a place that felt heavy with purpose. I had this feeling that when I got to the clearing, I was supposed to be looking for something. What was it waiting for me to find? This reoccurring dream continued. The vision haunted me, vivid and persistent, until one day it bled into reality. I rode for around an hour when it happened. I was climbing a familiar hill, my mind on autopilot. When I crested the rise, there, all of a sudden, was the intersection. It was real. A new trail splitting the forest, exactly as I'd dreamed. I locked my rear brakes, causing the rear end to slide sideways slightly. My heart pounded, the bike idling beneath me. I couldn't believe my eyes was this real. How could a dream carve itself into the world? I sat there for several minutes, my bike's motor idling, staring down the trail. The path stretched straight, its end shrouded in a haze I couldn't pierce. Looking down the trail, I couldn't see the end of it. It matched my dream perfectly. Yet doubt gnawed at me. I decided not to go down it, almost not believing that it was really there. I told myself I'd return tomorrow, to see if it was still there. The next day came, and I again ventured out into the woods. The intersection waited, unchanged, daring me to enter. I made the turn at the intersection, and that's when I slowly began riding down the trail. What lay at the end of this impossible path? I drove down the trail, staying in third gear, slow and steady. The forest was silent, the trees unnaturally still, as if holding their breath. It only took me about a minute to reach it, the clearing that is. There it was, the exact circle from my dreams, 50 feet wide, ringed by dense woods. The clearing itself was a perfect circle around 50 feet in diameter. I stopped, my bike's engine cutting off. I took off my helmet, looking around. What the heck, I whispered to myself. The air felt heavy, charged, like the moment before a storm. I couldn't make sense of this, though I thought that I was losing my mind or something. I walked around the circle confused, contemplating what it all meant. The ground was bare, no grass, just packed earth, as if something had pressed it flat. I began to feel an eerie feeling, though all of a sudden as if I was being watched. The hairs on my neck stood up, a chill creeping down my spine. A feeling of dread and danger suddenly crept up the back of my neck. I wasn't alone. Something was here, its gaze heavy, unseen. I felt as if I was suddenly somewhere that I was very much not supposed to be. Panic surged, primal and raw. Man, to heck with this, I said. I threw on my helmet, kicked the bike to life, and tore back down the trail. The clearing's weight chasing me. I peeled back down the trail, shifting gears, and I hauled back home. The forest blurred past, my heart racing with every twist. I rode for a few minutes when it suddenly hit me, though. Why the heck is it taking so long to get back? The trail stretched on, far longer than the minute it had taken to reach the clearing. It took less than a minute to reach the clearing, yet I've been riding down this trail for what felt like was several minutes. Panic tightened my chest. I started to panic, getting disoriented. The trees looked wrong, their shapes unfamiliar, the path unending. Maybe I'm just going the wrong way. I stopped, spun the bike around, and raced back toward the clearing. Within about 10 seconds, I made it back to the clearing all of a sudden. It was there again, mocking me with its perfect circle. I peeled around again, back down the trail again. I rode, pushing the bike harder, but the intersection never came. I stopped, got off my bike feeling defeated, confused, and a little bit scared now. Exhaustion hit, my legs trembling. I threw my helmet and collapsed next to a tree, sobbing on my knees. Tears fell, my screams echoing unanswered. I let out a frustrated and terrified scream. The woods grew dim, the sun sinking, and I felt trapped, lost in a place that shouldn't exist. I'm not sure how long I sat there for, but it felt like hours. The light faded, the forest closing in. I could see the sun dropping in the sky, the woods getting dimmer. Despair settled, heavy and cold. I started to feel like I was never going home. My mind blurred, and somehow, out of mental exhaustion, I must have fallen asleep with my back against a tree. Darkness took me, a mercy I didn't expect. I woke up immediately, jumped to my feet, wildly looking around. The sun was high, the air warm. I realized that the sun was shining brightly, and I was now back on the trail, my trail. The intersection was there, but I was free. I jumped onto my bike, riding as fast as I could to get home. I parked my bike and I quickly ran inside. My mother greeted me, her voice light. "Hi, honey," my mom said. I stammered, guilt and fear mixing. "I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. I just lost track of time. I managed to get out." She smiled, unconcerned. "It's only been an hour. I'm surprised you're already back inside, actually," my mom said. An hour? It felt like days. I stood there, mouth agape, staring at my mom. Her concern grew. "Are you okay, sweetie?" my mother asked me. I forced a smile, my voice hollow. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just not feeling well, I think." I fled to my room. The truth, too vast to share. I spent the next few days confused, replaying every moment through my head. The clearing, the endless trail, the dread. They haunted me. A puzzle with no edges. I wanted to just make sense of, well, everything, to have some logical reason for it all. But there just wasn't any. I stopped riding. the bike a reminder of a world I couldn't trust. In the end, I devised a plan, though, that looking back was honestly incredibly stupid. I needed answers, needed to face the clearing again. My dad was a bit of a tool connoisseur, any tool, hardware, rope, bungee cords. Among his treasures was a spool of yellow rope, 600 feet long. I decided that I was going to use that rope, tie it to a tree at the intersection. I went back out, getting to the trail intersection. The path was still there, a wound in the forest. I tied one end of the rope around my waist and used several bungee cords to tie the spool to a tree. The rope was my lifeline, my weight. I headed back down the trail, feeling a new boost of confidence. The clearing appeared, unchanged, its silence oppressive. I got off my bike, leaving it idling, and walked into the middle of the circle. The eerie feeling returned, stronger now. I started to get that eerie feeling again, as if I was being watched. But I pushed forward, determined. I felt determined to discover what it was that we were supposed to find here. I suddenly became fixated on one tree in particular. It stood apart, its bark blackened, scorched as if kissed by fire. This tree was darker than the rest, almost looking burned maybe. I approached, mesmerized, the air growing colder. Something began slowly peeking its head out from behind it. A face, black, decayed, not human, a mockery of life. The face was black, burned, decayed, and not human, almost like a bad imitation of one. Its hair was wiry, slick with soot. Its eyes met mine. My dirt bike's motor shut off all of a sudden. Silence crashed down, the forest holding its breath. I quickly turned back, but when I did, the thing was gone. Instinct screamed to run. I sprinted back to my bike, kick-started it harder than I ever had. The engine roared. A lifeline. I left my helmet behind, riding as fast as I could. But I'd walked too far. The rope slack. I had created way too much slack in the rope. It caught the chain. The wheel locking. The rope caught my chain. My rear wheel locked, and I was sent straight over the handlebars. Pain seared my ribs, but I staggered up, limping. The rope was still tied around my waist, but it had somehow been severed in the crash. The lifeline was gone. The forest closing in. I frantically looked around for the rest of the rope. Nothing. Just trees and silence. I saw it movement from the corner of my eye. A shadow darted. Too fast. Too deliberate. I saw more movement again out of the corner of my eye. It was circling, staying just out of sight. A predator playing with its prey. I took off running down the trail, abandoned my bike. My lungs burned, adrenaline driving me forward. I spotted the yellow rope, that beautiful yellow rope. It lay on the ground. A beacon. I literally screamed yes, running as quickly as I could toward it. But the rope moved, retracting, slithering away. The rope, it began retracting, dragging on the ground back up the trail. I ran after it as it seemed to run away from me. My legs screamed, my ribs ached, but I chased. I was hoping to see the intersection. Then, there it was, the intersection, salvation. I reached the intersection, crying, heaving, trying and failing to catch my breath. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. The yellow rope, the spool, was no longer bungeed to the tree. It led behind the tree, and then it emerged. It stepped out from behind the tree, revealing itself in its entirety. It was the thing from the clearing. Its form was twisted, charred, a grotesque parody of humanity. It had a look of pure malice in its gaze and a terrible smile. Its eyes were pools of endless darkness, devoid of empathy or humanity. They gleamed with ancient hunger, a predator's intelligence. It began to move towards me slowly. Its steps were silent, the air chilling with each motion. The air around me suddenly grew cold and carried a stench of like decay or something. Its body rippled, struggling to hold its shape. Its presence filled me with an overwhelming dread, a primal fear. I was frozen, my body locked in ice. I felt as if I was in ice water. I couldn't catch my breath, couldn't scream. Its voice came, a whisper scream that clawed at my mind. Its voice was terrible too, a twisted mixture of a whisper and a scream. As it approached closer and stood over me, I honestly thought that I was about to die. My thoughts twisted. Nightmares bleeding into reality. Everything just went black. I woke, sprawled on the familiar trail. The intersection gone. The rope vanished. I woke up back on my familiar trail. The intersection now gone. The rope now gone. No trace remained, as if it had never been. I was in shock and in pain, and I walked back home. I told my parents I'd crashed, my bike lost. My dad went back into the woods to look for it, but he never could find it. I didn't care. I was done with bikes, done with the woods. Since then, though, everything has felt different. A piece of me was gone, stolen by that thing. I feel like something is missing in me, as if that thing took something from me. Joy, love, hope. They felt distant, unreachable. I felt unable to enjoy anything, unable to have relationships, unable to care. Sleep was a battle. My nights restless. I struggle to sleep. I don't even really feel tired. I was a shell, moving through life without feeling it. I just couldn't really feel anything anymore. My family noticed. Their smiles strained, their worry palpable. My parents were trying their best, and they saw the changed me. Before we left, though, my dad was digging in the garage looking for something. "Hey, bud, have you seen my yellow rope?" he asked. The question sent me into a flashback of full terror, leaving me screaming, sobbing. I collapsed, begging for it to stop, the thing's eyes burning in my mind. From then on, I spent years in and out of therapy, and even institutions. The doctors called it trauma, dissociation, but I knew better. I am an adult now, but I've just never shaken the feeling of pure emptiness. The clearing had taken something vital, leaving me hollow. I decided that I'm going to go back to my childhood home, back to that familiar trail. The trail I knew like my own heartbeat. Now, a wound I couldn't ignore. If the intersection is there, then I'm going to go back down it. I'd face the clearing, the thing, whatever it was. I've decided that I'm going to try to kill that thing and get back the piece of myself that it clearly took. I'd reclaim what was mine, or die trying. If it kills me taking the rest of me, well, so be it. I couldn't live as a shadow anymore. Either way, I don't want to live like this anymore, and I'm going to be free of this. I prepared. Researching folklore, speaking to elders who knew the land. They spoke of spirits tied to the forest, entities that fed on life, on essence. One old woman, her eyes sharp, warned me, some things don't die, they take. I bought a knife, blessed it, carried salt and sage, rituals I barely believed in but clung to. The woods waited, their silence a challenge. I'd return, not as a boy, but as a man ready to fight. The clearing, the thing, the rope, they were my past, my pain, my purpose. I'd walk that path again, and this time, I'd end it. The forest is still out there, its secrets buried in its roots. I rode for around an hour when it happened. That moment, that intersection, changed me forever. The face was black, burned, decayed, and not human. Its eyes, its smile, its voice, they're etched into me. A wound that never heals. I feel like something is missing in me. I live, but I'm not whole. A piece of my soul lost to that clearing. I don't know what it was. A demon, a spirit, a god of the woods. But it saw me, chose me, took from me. I'm going to be free of this. My return is a promise, a vow to face the thing and reclaim myself, or die trying. The path stole my soul, but I'll steal it back, or burn the forest down with me. The morning mist. The dawn is soft. Your room a haven. But what happens when the morning light reveals something that shouldn't be there? A shape in the mist, playing a game only you can see? You're a child, tucked in bed, the world still waking. Then it appears, a foggy figure, half-formed, peering from the doorway. It hides, it shows, it watches. It's not your imagination. You pinch yourself, count, recite. You're awake, but it's still there, flickering like static, bound to the frame of your door. It's not human, not ghost, but something else, something old. This isn't a nightmare. It's a ritual, a morning visitor that knows your name. It doesn't scare you, it fascinates you. But what is it? And why does it come for you? This is the story of Clara, a girl who shared her mornings with a presence no one else could see. By the time you hear the end, you'll wonder what lingers in the corners of your own home. The house stood like a relic, its ancient timbers groaning under the weight of centuries. Clara, a young girl, grew up in its shadow, surrounded by the wild beauty of Appalachia. It was beautiful, but she hated the vibes. There always felt nasty and sort of unclean. The air was heavy, as if the walls held secrets they couldn't release. Between the ages of young childhood, she would see a fuzzy, misty sort of apparition that would play peekaboo with her in the mornings as she lay in bed. It appeared at dawn, a spectral guest in her bedroom. At first, it would be misty and become intermittently more solid, waxing and waning in its visibility like power surges. Clara would lie still, watching it shift. For a long time she would stare, thinking that she was half asleep. But she would count spell words, do her ABCs later, recite prime numbers, pinch herself, move about to make sure that she was awake, and she can assure you that she always was. She was no dreamer. She was alert. Her mind sharp. She's a pretty straightforward person, always has been. But she couldn't believe her eyes. The figure wasn't frightening, but it was wrong. A head and shoulders. Formless yet present. Dancing at the edge of her door. She got used to it, and it would just keep playing peekaboo. As she read her books and magazines, went and got some cereal. Sometimes took a bath, then came back and read. It became routine, a strange companion. Later, when she got a TV, she would watch cartoons, and it would be there. It sort of became her morning ghost buddy. She guesses she did her thing, and it did its thing. It was a misty shape of a head and shoulder, and featureless, but semi-solid. She could see through it, but also it was like staticky, and would sometimes be more obvious, and then sort of fade back to a less solid fog. Also, it sort of looked like moving particles if you stare long enough, like static from a TV, but more white. It was mesmerizing, a phenomenon she couldn't explain. It didn't feel scary, but just odd to her. It was almost like she was witnessing something highly unusual, and it was sort of bemusing a phenomena of sorts. Clara felt its gaze, its intention, as if it chose her, but it was trapped, tethered to the doorway, unable to cross. The freakiest part is that it was doing the little peek thing at the top corner of the 10-foot door frame. Sometimes a little more than the head and shoulders would move out, and it would be an amorphous blob. But it's like there was a barrier, and it couldn't move far beyond the door frame. She didn't even know if it was actually truly conscious enough to be playing with her, or it was sort of stuck there at the frame and doing its thing. She sort of felt like it had some intention, just a feeling she had. But that's what it was. It lingered, then faded as the sun climbed. Eventually, it would stop, or the light got so bright that it would not be discernible. She never saw it at night, or dusk, or any time during the day. If she took a nap, this was only in the morning hours. The mornings were its domain, a ritual bound to dawn. The house held more than the figure. Its history whispered of violence, of lives lost in shadows. Looking at the history of the house that was built by a distant relative who owned a sawmill and local hotel, he was a bad actor. From what she understands, the builder, a man of ill repute, left a stain. At some point there was a fire, and the stairwell and the upper floor were damaged and reconstructed. Not a devastating fire that killed anyone, but the stairwell in the foyer on the second floor by her bedroom was not the original. Maybe that guy, though. Maybe he killed somebody there because he was a southern gangster of sorts and was involved in getting rid of some folks, or so it said. Some people did pass away at the house of old age, and natural causes wakes were held there, so maybe a ghost. Appalachia's ancient land carried stories older than the house. Appalachia is old, with history, predating the settlers. So who knows, to her knowledge, no dramatic deaths. And her family are all about knowing the scoop on the family drama, so they could never find anything there. The house eventually burned down due to electrical issues during renovations after they sold it, but it had a majorly creepy vibe in some of the rooms. The attic was worse, a place where the air pressed down, where eyes unseen followed her every move. She had a playroom in the attic, and sometimes she would be playing in there and feel like she was being watched, and the hair of her arms would actually stand up like fear or static in the air, and her ears would start to ring too. She describes it a bit like the air changed, like when you go to higher altitudes and your ears pop, or when the silence becomes audible, a shift in silence from normal silence to sort of complete and thick silence. It was a total atmospheric shift, a pressure change. Clara froze, instinct guiding her. She would be so afraid that she would almost get a freeze response, but she somehow knew not to react like that, like she was scared, but to put her things away per usual and calmly leave like normal without freaking out or getting hurried. As she got older, she heard some bad energies feed on fear, so it's interesting as a kid that she knew in her gut not to react like that. Just sort of remove herself, but don't overreact. She's always had a good poker face, and maybe that's why she doesn't scare easily. Even in situations that would warrant panic, she'll freak out later. But in the moment, she just tries to stay cool, like autopilot, or going numb. Which is good in times when you need your wits. That's the first time that she remembers engaging in that mode in her attic playroom. Beyond the house, the land held its own terrors. A cotton field, beautiful yet cursed, stirred something deep within her. They lived in a mountainous area, foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. At the base of the mountain, there was a huge cotton field. It was pretty beautiful, actually, but she would freak out when she saw it. Her mom said that it started as a toddler, but she would look at the field as they drove by, and she would start hyperventilating, whimpering, and get tearful. Later, when she got older, she would just hide under a blanket until they passed it to manage her exposure. As she got even older, she would just look at it and try to figure out what about it vexed her. It was a stunning visage, beautiful and picturesque. Nothing that she knows of happened there, like a battle or recent bad history or anything. But her mind saw something her eye could not, and it was freaky. And for whatever reason, she hated it. As an adult, she no longer gets that feeling at all when she sees the field. Just a peaceful place she guesses people even take pictures when the cotton blooms there. Also, there's sunflower fields adjacent to it, and that's pretty glorious. It's a sunny patch in the middle of the mountains, a valley with meadows, and coming off the mountain, you get a bird's eye view. And it's honestly like no other. But as a kid, for whatever reason, she wanted to walk a wide circle around it, and she means a very wide circle. Clara's childhood was marked by these mysteries. The mist, the attic, the field, each a thread in the tapestry of a house that never felt like home. The message from the old house. The old house stood in the Pennsylvania mountains, its weathered beams a testament to centuries past, whispering secrets of ancestors long gone. A young girl walked its creaking floors, her heart tied to its history, unaware that the walls held more than memories. They held intent. She loved the house, its ancient photos staring back, some faces known, others lost to time. But the air was heavy, the shadows restless, and when her sandals vanished from the fireplace, the house spoke, its message clear. Some things were meant to stay. Years later, she returned, her daughter's laughter filling the rooms. But the house hadn't forgotten her. A vape pen left on the kitchen table disappeared, swallowed by the same unseen hands. A silent rebuke from those who'd never approved of vice. The losses were personal, her belongings the only ones to vanish, as if the house chose her, its oldest heir, to carry its will. Each missing item was a whisper, a nudge from the past, urging her to listen, to understand. The house was alive, its ancestors watching, their presence a bond and a burden. She was theirs, bound by blood, and the things they took were signs, warnings that the old house would never let her go. My grandfather's family had lived in the mountains of very rural central Pennsylvania since the 1700s. The land was rugged, its peaks and valleys a cradle for generations, its soil steeped in their stories. My great-great-grandfather built an expansion onto a house or loft that his father had built. The house was a legacy, its beams hewn from the forest, its walls a chronicle of survival. The house still stands today, and we still go there. It was a retreat, a place where time slowed, its rooms a bridge to the past. It's 8 miles from a very large and beautiful lake. The lake was a mirror, its waters reflecting the mountains, its beauty a draw for our family's escapes. I've been going there since I was a kid, and we call it the old house. As a child, I ran through its halls, its creaks a lullaby, its scent of aged wood a comfort. The house is filled with very old photos. Some of the photos we know the ancestors in them, some we actually don't. The photos lined the walls, their eyes following, some familiar, others strangers whose names were lost. Some of the photos, though, are very creepy. Their gazes were heavy, their expressions stern, as if they judged the living who dared to linger. When I was a child, I had one pair of sandals that I was wearing, and I would always take them off next to the fireplace, which didn't work anymore. The fireplace was a relic, its hearth cold, a gathering place for my shoes and dreams. On the morning that we had to leave to go back home, the sandals that I was wearing were now gone. The loss was sudden. The sandals missing from their usual spot. A puzzle with no answer. They weren't next to the fireplace anymore. Both my parents and my grandfather, who was there, searched the entire house high and low for my sandals, but they could never find them. The search was frantic. Every corner checked. The house's small size making the loss absurd. Keep in mind that this house is not very large. They searched for hours too before they finally gave up. And I made the ride back home without my shoes. Barefoot, I left. The loss a quiet wound. The house's silence mocking. My grandfather stayed at the house for another day before going back home. When my grandfather woke up the next day, the sandals, they were right there next to the fireplace where I had left them. Their return was a shock. Their placement deliberate, as if the house had held them, waiting. My grandfather told my mom that they must have not wanted her to leave. His words were a whisper, a hint of something beyond. The house a keeper of its own desires. The old house was more than wood and stone. It was a guardian, its ancestors alive in its shadows, their will a force that shaped the present. My sandals were a message, a sign that the house claimed me, its oldest heir, as its own. I grew up, but the house remained, its pull unbroken, its photos watching. Each visit was a homecoming, but the losses followed, my belongings vanishing, a pattern only I bore, as if the ancestors spoke to me alone, with my daughter by my side. I returned, her laughter a light in the dim rooms, but the house was waiting. A vape pen, left on the kitchen table, disappeared, its absence a rebuke, the ancestors' judgment clear in the silence that followed. The house was a puzzle, its losses a language I couldn't fully read. My family laughed, called it a quirk, but I felt the weight, the connection to those who'd come before. Their presence, a bond I couldn't break. Each missing item was a thread, weaving me to the past, a reminder that the old house was alive, its ancestors guiding, warning, holding me close. One day, it would be mine, but I wondered, what else would it take from me? I've always loved this house and have felt very close to my ancestors while in it, but that was pretty creepy. The love was deep, a tie to my blood, but the creepiness lingered, a shadow on my heart. I went to the house with my daughter and my friend. I set a vape pen down on the kitchen table. The kitchen was warm, its table a gathering place, the pen a casual choice. My daughter and friend were outside picking apples off of an apple tree behind the house. Their voices drifted in, a moment of joy, the house quiet in their absence. I went outside to load up my car, and when I came back in, the vape pen was not on the kitchen table. The loss was immediate, the table bare, the pen gone without a trace. Nobody else had been in the house between the time that I had set the pen on the table and the time that I had come back in. The house was empty, its doors locked, yet the pen was missing. A theft with no thief. We searched the entire house and there was just no vape pen to be found. Every drawer, every corner, every shadow, nothing yielded the pen. The house's silence, a taunt. I and my family members have been back at that house half a dozen times since, and no vape pen was ever found or recovered. The loss was permanent. The pen a ghost. Its absence a mystery that grew with each visit. My ancestors never drank or smoked from what my grandfather tells us. Their lives were austere, their values strict, passed down through stories. My mom tells me all the time that it was them telling you to stop. Her words were half jest, half belief, a hint that the ancestors disapproved. There will a force in the house. Not super scary or anything, but it is definitely completely unexplainable. The events were eerie, their logic absent, a puzzle with no solution. I've always felt a crazy deep connection to that house too, and have taken it upon myself to research and gather a lot of information about my ancestors who lived on that land. The research was a passion, a way to know them, their lives a thread I followed through time. I am the oldest grandchild, and one day that house will become mine, as we always pass it down to the oldest member of the family. The inheritance was a duty, a bond, but also a weight. The house's will a legacy I'd carry. Weirdly enough, too, I seem to be the only person whose belongings always go missing in that house. The pattern was mine alone. My things the house's chosen offerings, a sign that I was marked, bound to its past. The losses were small but pointed, each one a whisper from the ancestors, a reminder that the old house was more than a home. It was a keeper of souls, its walls alive with their presence, its will a force I couldn't escape. The murderer's wings. The neon sign flickered, casting a greasy glow over the empty parking lot of a new wing joint in Royersford, Pennsylvania. I pulled up, the hum of my car engine, the only sound in the quiet night, my stomach growling for a late-night fix. So I live in Pennsylvania just outside of Philly, and the following happened. My wife and I had been craving wings, and a quick online search led us to this place, fresh on the scene. The man behind the counter seemed harmless, his laugh echoing as he handed me my order. But months later, his face would haunt me. This is the story of how I met a murderer over a plate of bad wings. The craving hit us hard, a shared hunger for something spicy and satisfying. It was a late November evening, and my wife and I were craving wings that day. A quick search brought up a new joint in Royersford, PA that had just opened. I scrolled through reviews, found the place, and placed an online order. I put in an online order, and then I zip on by. The drive was short, the town's streets familiar, yet strangely still. The man behind the counter, middle-aged African-American gentleman with a jovial disposition and a hearty laugh. He greeted me with a wide smile, his voice warm as we chatted. We talked about the Eagles while he got my food ready. The Eagles were having a rough season, and we bonded over their latest loss, his laughter filling the small shop. Eventually I thanked him and I left. I grabbed the bag, the wings' aroma promising more than they'd deliver, and drove home. The wings were a letdown, soggy and oversalted, barely touched. The wings, they weren't good at all, as I recall, too. We laughed it off, vowing to try another spot next time. The evening fading into routine. A few months later, he is in the news apparently for killing his business partner. I was scrolling through local news when his face appeared, unmistakable, tied to a chilling headline. Apparently, over a money dispute, she had funds, and he wanted them for a new location, but she allegedly refused. He'd killed her, his partner, over a fight for cash. He buried her outside of an industrial area and parked her car elsewhere. Her body was hidden, her car abandoned to throw off the trail. The police found evidence of him being in her car, several failed attempts to get access to her Cash App or Venmo account, evidence of a struggle in her home. Digital traces and signs of violence led to his arrest, and before long, Chicken Wing Guy was actually arrested, tried and convicted of his business partner's murder. I didn't connect it at first. The memory of that night blurred. I didn't connect it immediately too until later, that this was the same guy who had served me after an article named the business that he owned. The article named the restaurant. And it clicked. Those wings, that laugh, that man. It was the very restaurant that I got wings at a few months prior. His jovial face hid a darkness I'd never sensed. But he was a convicted murderer, and I was served by him. I replayed our chat, his ease, his charm, now tainted by truth. How had I stood there, joking, while he carried that secret? The restaurant closed soon after, its sign dark, but the memory lingers. A casual encounter with a killer, served alongside wings I'll never forget. The sheet in the woods. The yell pierced the night. An old man's cry for help, but no one lived on that road. Then I saw it. A white sheet, 8 feet tall, staring without eyes, vanishing behind a tree, waiting for me to follow. I whistled in the dark, ignoring his warning, and the woods answered with a scream. A faceless pillar of white stood by the fallen tree, its gaze locking me in place, daring me to move. It moved faster than light, a ghostly sheet slipping behind the tree. I felt its stare, heavy as death, and walked home in silence, knowing the woods weren't mine anymore. The road was empty, but the cry wasn't human. A white figure loomed, tall and still, watching me from the grass. I didn't run. I couldn't, but I'll never forget its weight on my soul. Grandma said I looked like I'd seen a ghost, and she was right. The sheet in the woods saw me, knew me, and its silent threat followed me home. A mystery I can't shake. My Gertie and my grandma's property is settled all the way in the back of the woods at the end of a long, unpaved road. The house was a weathered cabin, nestled deep in a tangle of oaks and pines, far from the hum of civilization. Along with being comically bumpy, it also has a history of hauntings that were passed between family members over the years. The road was a trial, its ruts and puddles a gauntlet that tested every visitor. Family stories painted the land as alive with spirits, tales of whispers and shadows handed down like heirlooms. I myself was somewhat skeptical of these tales, not because I'm not a believer of the paranormal, but because my uncle and father have a habit of being very exaggerative. Their stories grew taller with each telling. Silver buried at the property's corners to appease a deer spirit. Knocks on the counter at midnight. Folklore I have dismissed, until one night about a year ago back then, I lived with my grandma down at the end of that road. The cabin was home, its creaky floors and wood stove a comfort despite its isolation. And at the time, I also didn't own a car. My lack of wheels tethered me to the property, reliant on others for transport. As such, my boyfriend had to walk to my house from the entrance of the road, since his parents didn't want to risk damaging their vehicles on the aforementioned bumpy road. His visits were a ritual, his footsteps crunching through the gravel to reach me. Mind you, this road is a good 20 minutes walk from the beginning to the end, completely overgrown with bushes and trees, and has a puddle every other step. The path was wild, its overgrowth clawing at passers-by, its mud a constant hazard. So more often than not, I'd meet him about halfway, and then walk him back to the entrance once he went home. That night, when we were walking back to the entrance, I decided to tell him about the property's haunted history. The air was cool, the woods alive with crickets, their song a backdrop to my tales. From the silver buried on 4 corners of the property, to appease a supposed deer spirit to the knocking on the counter at night, I spilled every tale that I'd ever heard. The stories poured out, a mix of family legend and local lore, each one stranger than the last. Now, unlike me, he was genuinely afraid of such tales, as he himself had once had an experience very similar, albeit much more terrifying, to the one that I was about to have. His fear was palpable, his eyes darting to the shadows, his voice low as he shared a memory of his own, a night that left him shaken, a brush with something he wouldn't name. He warned me not to do one thing: don't whistle at night. The warning was firm, a rule rooted in his own dread. Now, a thing to know about me: I'm a habitual whistler and tend to do it without even thinking about it. The habit was second nature, a tune always on my lips, a reflex as natural as breathing. So of course, on my way back, I began to sing a tune. Alone on the road, the woods pressing close, I whistled a melody, soft and aimless, filling the silence. The night was strange, the sky a dull blue, its light lingering longer than it should. The woods were quiet, their usual chorus muted, as if holding their breath. That particular night, it was unusually bright outside for being so late. The sky was still a dull blue, and there was hardly a shadow. The clarity was unsettling, the world too visible, too exposed. And I got into the quarter mark of the road, an almost gateway of bushes on a small ridge going further into the road, when I heard something yell. The sound was sharp, cutting through the night, a raw edge to it that stopped me cold. A yell that very, very distinctly sounded like an old man. The voice was weathered, desperate, echoing from the trees. Later, once I got home, I'd realized that there was a word in that yell to help. The word crystallized in my memory, a plea that hadn't registered at first. At the time, I didn't think too much of it, which, yes, was especially dumb of me. I know, the oversight was foolish, a lapse I couldn't excuse, but the moment felt unreal. A trick of the wind. I'd love to pull out every excuse under the sun, but I was evidently feeling very stupid that night. My mind brushed it off, clinging to logic in the face of the strange. Now that I've had time to think about it too, I've noted two things. One, there was no possible way that there could have been an elderly man on or near the road. The road was private, its end marked by Grandma's cabin, the only dwelling for miles. My grandma is the only person that lives on that end of the road. No neighbors, no passers-by, just the woods and their secrets. Second, as I mentioned, was the word in the yell help. The cry was deliberate, a lure that tugged at my instincts. My boyfriend, after hearing the story, said it was meant to be a lure, but for what? Me, death, all that fun stuff. His words chilled me, his theory dark but plausible, a trap set by something unseen. The road stretched on, its puddles glinting under the strange blue light, the bushes clawing at my sleeves. I walked, my whistle fading, the yell's echo lingering in my mind. The woods were too quiet, their silence a pressure, as if the trees themselves were watching. My steps were steady, but my heart wasn't. Each sound, a twig snap, a leaf rustle, amplified in the stillness. The road's halfway mark loomed, a familiar field of dead yellow grass, its edges wild, its center marked by a single fallen tree, a landmark I'd passed countless times. The yell hung in the air, a hook I'd ignored, but the woods were listening, and something was waiting. As I walked, I got to the halfway mark of the road, a field of dead yellow grass, and a single fallen tree on the left-hand side of the road lay there. The field was desolate, its grass brittle, the tree a gnarled skeleton against the sky. I'd seen it hundreds of times before, and every time I thought, why is that tree still there? Its permanence was a mystery, a fixture that defied time. As I took my courtesy look at the tree, that was when I noticed something, or someone. The sight was a shock, a break in the familiar. Yet to this day, I don't know what I saw, to be honest. The memory is vivid but elusive, a shape that resists definition. It wasn't a cryptid, not a monster, nor a demon, but standing a good 30 feet away from the tree was honest to God. And what I can only describe it as was a sheet ghost. The figure was surreal, a pillar of white, rounded at the top, its form impossibly smooth. A simple rounded pillar of white, nearly 8 feet tall, and as still as the tree before it. It stood there, and it saw me too. I know it did. The gaze was a weight, heavy and unyielding, pinning me in place. Had no eyes, no face, but I could feel its gaze upon me. The absence of features was worse, a blankness that held intent, a silent scrutiny. I had never truly known fear before that night, but I froze in place and felt like a mouse beneath a cat's paw, caught and hopeless. My body was rigid, my breath shallow, the world narrowing to that white shape. Faster than I could blink, it ducked behind the tree and seemed to stay there 30 feet traversed in under a second. The movement was unnatural, a blur that defied physics, the figure vanishing behind the tree's bulk. Once it was behind the tree, it stayed there and I could move again. The spell broke, my limbs my own, but the fear remained, a cold knot in my chest. The sensible among you probably think that I ran, but I didn't. I didn't want to get its attention again. Running felt like a challenge, a provocation I couldn't risk. 10 minutes of absolute silence and paranoia. As I walked home, I was utterly terrified. Each step was deliberate, my eyes fixed ahead, my senses straining for any sign of pursuit. The road seemed endless, its puddles mocking, its bushes closing in. The blue sky faded, the night reclaiming its depth, but the figure's gaze lingered, a phantom weight on my shoulders. I walked, my heart a drum, the woods a silent witness to my fear. I got home, and there sat my grandma on her little red couch, smoking a cigarette. The cabin was a beacon, its warm light spilling onto the porch. Grandma's silhouette, a comfort. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she chuckled. Her laugh was light, but her eyes were sharp, reading the terror on my face. Well, to be honest, I think I had. The words felt true, a confession of something I couldn't name. I have gotten all kinds of answers over the years for what I saw Skinwalker Wendigo hide behind. Friends and family offered theories, each one darker than the last, from folklore to local legend. For now, I just want to share my story and let speculation generate more ideas as to maybe what I saw. So if you have any ideas, then please do share. The question remains open. A mystery I carry. Its edges as blurred as the figure itself. The cabin was safe, its walls a shield, but the road's memory haunted me. Grandma's stories, once tall tales, gained weight, their details sharper in the light of my encounter. The sheet ghost, if that's what it was, felt ancient, tied to the land's secrets, its purpose unknown. I stopped whistling at night, my lips sealed, the habit broken by fear. The road became a place of caution, its puddles and trees no longer mundane, each step a negotiation with the unseen. My boyfriend's warning echoed, a lesson learned too late, his own fear a mirror to mine. The woods held their secrets close, and I was content to let them. The sheet in the field, a riddle I'd never solve. The sheet is gone, but the woods remember, and I walk their path with eyes wide, knowing it saw me, and I saw it. The locked vault. The cemetery was a place of quiet endings, but its shadows held secrets that refused to rest. Many things in my life have been very spooky, but a pinnacle event always stands out. I worked in a graveyard built on the ashes of a carriage house, a site scarred by fire and loss. I worked in a cemetery that was built on the grounds of a carriage house that burned down, taking at least one human and some horses with it. A pauper's grave, its origins murky, added to the unease. Now there was also a popa's grave of unknown remains transplanted from a tiny rural graveyard there too. What lingers here, watching from the dark? The office was a battleground of nerves, haunted by a presence I couldn't ignore, a male shadow figure, his cane tapping down the hall, and very, very aware of the male shadow figure who lured around the office. You could hear him walking with a cane up and down the hall. His ominous aura chilled me, a constant reminder of the unseen. It always put me on edge. He felt ominous and disquieting. One day, a burial family failed to appear, leaving me alone with the silence. I had a burial that day, and the family no-showed. Is someone else here? Or is it just him? Footsteps echoed in the lobby, a fleeting presence that vanished when I checked. Later on, I swore that I heard someone in the lobby down the hall from my office, though. But when I got there, they were gone. I searched, finding no cars but mine in the lot. Finally, I realized there were no cars in the lot besides mine. The emptiness was a trick, a game played by something unseen, and I hadn't caught a glimpse of someone just rounding a corner since Salop ago. So perhaps they left. In the vault, a massive records room, the air grew heavy. What's waiting for me? The vault door slammed shut behind me, locking me inside without a key. Later on, I was in the giant vault that doubled as our records room. When my back was turned, the door slammed shut. My phone, my lifeline, was elsewhere. It can only be opened with a key from the inside. And guess what? Wasn't on me, as well as my cell phone. A man's chuckle taunted from outside, cruel and deliberate. I could meanwhile distinctly hear a man chuckling outside, though. Panic clawed at me as I faced days of entrapment, sitting against the door, calculating how many hours till Monday got here. Will I get out alive? Then, the door flew open, hurling me backward into darkness. Before I could talk myself really off of the deep end, the door suddenly bolted open, and I flopped back, knocking myself off the metal threshold. I awoke to a familiar leathery scent and shuffling steps near my ear. Hours later, I woke up after apparently being knocked out. The sound of a dull shuffle stepped near my ear, oddly startling me. Or maybe I got a sudden whiff of the familiar leathery cologne. I fled, the cemetery's weight behind me. I wasted no time in looking up and leaving. What was in that vault with me? The cemetery was more than a resting place. It was a keeper of tragedies, its grounds soaked in the sorrow of a fire that claimed lives, taking at least one human and some horses with it. The pauper's grave, relocated from a forgotten plot, seemed to anchor something restless, transplanted from a tiny rural graveyard there too. My shifts were solitary, the office a stage for the shadow figure's relentless pacing. You could hear him walking with a cane up and down the hall. His presence wasn't just unsettling, it was a warning, a signal that I wasn't alone. That day, the absence of the burial family amplified the silence, making every sound suspect. The family no-showed. The lobby's footsteps were a phantom's tease, leading me on a futile chase. Down the hall from my office, though, but when I got there, they were gone. The empty lot mocked my search, confirming no one had come, no cars in the lot besides mine. In the vault, surrounded by dusty records, I felt the weight of the past pressing in, as if the walls themselves held secrets too heavy to contain. The door's sudden closure was no accident. It was a trap, sealed by an unseen hand. The door slammed shut. Without a key or phone, I was at the mercy of whatever roamed the halls. Guess what wasn't on me, as well as my cell phone? The chuckle outside was a taunt, a voice that knew my fear. Distinctly hear a man chuckling outside. I pounded on the door, my shout swallowed by the vault's cold embrace. My mind racing with thoughts of being forgotten until the next shift. When the door opened, it was a violent release, throwing me into unconsciousness. The door suddenly bolted open, and I flopped back. The leathery cologne, a scent that clung to the office, was my only clue as I woke. A sudden whiff of the familiar leathery cologne. The shuffling steps were too close, too real. The sound of a dull shuffle stepped near my ear. I ran, the cemetery's history chasing me. Its shadows no longer just stories, but a truth I'd felt. I wasted no time in leaving. The vault had shown me something I couldn't unsee, a glimpse of what lingers beyond the grave. The phantom of the camp. The camp was nestled in a forgotten valley, its ancient cabins whispering tales of a war-torn past. Said place is beautiful, but gives off an off vibe, I guess almost like it's lost in time. That night, as we lay in our bunks, I woke to a shadow standing over my sleeping friend. It wasn't one of us. It couldn't be. When I turn, I see the silhouette of my classmate just sort of standing and staring at his bed. My heart stopped as it crouched, watching, then vanished. What was it? And why was it there? Midnight in the dorm was silent, save for our whispers in the dark. We were just sort of lying there, talking, joking, and laughing in the dark, since the lights were out. Then I woke to see my best friend staring, wide-eyed, at a figure by our classmate's bunk. I see the silhouette crouch, and notice that my classmate was fully asleep in his bed. It wasn't human, not with that movement. We hid under our sheets, hearts pounding. Years later, we still can't explain it. The forest around the camp felt alive, its shadows heavier than they should be. The place has been shrouded in mysteries and horror stories. In our dorm, I woke to a nightmare, a figure looming over a sleeping friend, its form wrong, unnatural. Almost at the same time, my friend and I react and look at each other wide-eyed. We saw it together, a shared terror that wasn't one of us. There was no way that it was one of us because we were all accounted for in our bunks. It's haunted us ever since. I thought the camp's ghost stories were just tales to scare kids, but that night proved me wrong. I rose my head from the sheets to see my best friend in his bunk in front of me, also raising his head. We both saw it, a shadow standing by our friend's bed, motionless, watching. I laugh quietly and nod to my friend, as to play a prank on him. But then before we could act, it crouched, then vanished, leaving us trembling. The fact that my friend saw the exact same thing that I did, well, it gave me huge chills. What was watching us? The old camp felt frozen in time, its history soaked in blood and fire. The whole town was once burned to the ground in a very gruesome war. In the dead of night, I woke to a figure in our dorm, staring at my sleeping classmate. Both of us cover ourselves in our sheets, doing our best to fall asleep again. My friend saw it too, a silhouette that wasn't one of us. I hope one day that I get an explanation for what happened that night, but somehow I just don't think I will. It's a memory we can't escape. I'm from a small country in South America and attended a religious school. Every year, Our school took us to a spiritual retreat, a camp nestled in a valley where a small river carved through fields and a forested mountain loomed nearby. Said place is beautiful, but gives off an off vibe, I guess almost like it's lost in time due to its very old structures. The cabins were weathered, their wooden beams etched with decades of wear, and the air felt heavy, as if the place was caught in a forgotten era. The place has been shrouded in mysteries and horror stories. Elders spoke of a town raised in a brutal 19th century war, its scars still lingering in the soil. The whole town was once burned to the ground in a very gruesome war that almost wiped out my country off the map in the 1800s. It was my final year of school, our last camp, and the day had been exhausting. After a long day, all of my class was tired from hiking the forest next to the camp after dinner, and a short stay at the campfire we were sent to bed. We'd trekked through dense trails, the forest's canopy swallowing the sun, leaving us drained but buzzing with stories around the fire. My class was small, mostly girls, with only 6 guys, including me. There were very few young men there, only about 6, including me, so we had the whole dorm hull for us, and that was pretty sweet. The boys' dorm was a long, creaking hall, built for 40, but housing only us 6. This dorm, which was housing only 16s, was a long hall full of bunks made for at least 40 people. We claimed the top bunks, 3 on each side, facing each other like a mirrored row. Since we didn't have to share, we all chose top bunks next to each other, 3 on my side, including me, and 3 on the row facing me. The night was warm. The windows cracked open, letting in the hum of crickets. We were just sort of lying there, talking, joking, and laughing in the dark, since the lights were out. Our voices bounced off the walls, jokes about the day's hikes, plans for the summer. Exhaustion took over, and I drifted off, the laughter fading into silence. I don't know what woke me, but my eyes snapped open in the pitch-black dorm. Rose my head from the sheets to see my best friend in his bunk in front of me, also raising his head. Across from me, my best friend, Mateo, was awake too, his eyes glinting in the faint moonlight. He sort of nods jokingly to the bunk next to him, where another classmate was sleeping. He tilted his head toward our classmate Luis's bunk, a playful smirk on his face. When I turn, I see the silhouette of my classmate just sort of standing and staring at his bed. A figure stood there, tall and still, outlined against the window, staring down at Luis's sleeping form. I laugh quietly and nod to my friend, as to play a prank on him. But then, before we could act, I thought it was one of us, maybe Luis himself, pulling a late-night stunt. I grinned at Mateo, ready to whisper a plan, but then the figure moved. I see the silhouette crouch and notice that my classmate was fully asleep in his bed. It crouched low, its movement slow and unnatural, like a predator sizing up prey. My breath caught as I saw Luis, still in his bunk, fast asleep. Almost at the same time, my friend and I react and look at each other wide-eye. Mateo's eyes widened, mirroring my panic. Both of us cover ourselves in our sheets, doing our best to fall asleep again. Somehow we eventually managed to do so. We hid under our blankets, hearts pounding, willing ourselves to sleep, praying the figure wouldn't turn to us. The dorm was silent. No footsteps, no creaks, just the oppressive weight of being watched. Morning came, gray and heavy, and I found Mateo before breakfast. The next morning I went straight to my friend, and before I could finish asking if he saw it too, he just interrupted with a yes. "You saw it," I whispered. "Yes," he said, his voice low, describing the same silhouette, the same crouch. He told me exactly what he saw. It was the same thing. We confronted Luis, explaining what we'd seen. We approached this classmate and explained it to him. Of course, he thought that we were joking. He laughed, calling us paranoid, insisting he'd been asleep all night. There was no way that it was one of us, because we were all accounted for in our bunks. We checked. Every bunk was occupied, no one missing. The fact that my friend saw the exact same thing that I did, well, it gave me huge chills. Mateo and I exchanged glances, our certainty unshaken. Both me and my friend remember that event to this day, talking about it every now and then, almost 7 or 8 years after it happened. The camp ended, but the memory didn't. We left the valley, its river and forest fading into the distance, but the figure stayed with us. I hope one day that I get an explanation for what happened that night, but somehow I just don't think I will. I've scoured X for similar stories, finding tales of shadows in old camps, figures that watch but never speak. Some say it's the ghosts of the war, soldiers burned in the town's destruction. Others talk of spirits tied to the land, restless and vengeful. I don't know what we saw, but it wasn't human. Years later, Mateo and I still text about it. The memory as vivid as that night. I've avoided camp since, sticking to city life where lights drown out the dark. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I feel that same weight, like something's watching. I check my apartment windows, half expecting a silhouette outside. The valley's stories were true. Something lingers there, something that saw us and let us go. But why demand on, and what happens if it finds us again? The run beyond the body. I was traveling up and down Chile. The land was vast, a tapestry of mountains, deserts, and coastlines that stretched forever. Backpacking essentially, but we had some friends here and there. My friends and I roamed, free and wild, chasing adventure. One of our home bases was the parents of one in our group. Their home was a haven, a place to rest and laugh. His stepfather was a natural doctor. He was kind, wise, brewing remedies from herbs and hope. But when sickness struck me in the desert, why did the cure feel like a curse? I contracted something severe at one point in the Atacama Desert, the driest place on earth, where life clings by a thread, had turned against me. Over the course of 3 weeks, while my friends continued on, I was slowly dying. Fever burned through me, my body wasting away. This dude was giving me 30 drops of this and that, or 46 of this and that. The stepfather's potions, tinctures, teas, did little, my strength fading with each dose. As I was convulsing in their bathtub, the mother decided enough was enough. Her voice cut through the haze. Urgent. Final. Why was I slipping further from the world? She decided I had to go to the hospital. The mother's decision was a lifeline, pulling me from the edge. The journey to the hospital was a blur. Lights, voices, the cold bite of an IV. But something else happened. Something beyond the physical. I just remember the feeling of the winter's grass on my heels as I ran down a giant hill. The sensation was vivid, impossible. I was running, free, the air cool and sharp. I wanted so bad to reach them. My friends were down there, their laughter calling me. How could I feel so alive when my body was failing? I arrived and no one noticed at all. I stood among my friends, their faces familiar, their voices clear. But I was invisible. I observed them for what felt like more than a minute after running upon them, and no one even flinching. They talked, laughed, unaware of me. It was startling, but it made me stay perfectly still and just listen. The world felt paused, their words mundane yet vivid. One of my friends was talking about agricultural class, where you meet the cows with holes in their stomachs. A strange topic, yet I heard every detail. Why could I see them? But they couldn't see me. In the blink of an eye, a woman who I'd never met before, but looked so weirdly like me, suddenly was to my left. She appeared, her face hauntingly familiar, a mirror of my own but older, wiser. She said, "Go back now." Her voice was gentle, like a mother's, but carried an urgency that pierced me. It wasn't a threat. It was like a mother tells a toddler. I turned, compelled, a mix of fear and joy driving me. I ran back up this wet, thick hill without seeing or speaking to her again. The grass, the mud, the ferns, they were real, pulling me back to life. Who was she? And why did she save me? I woke up in the hospital to a man, almost laughing, telling me that he'd never seen someone so dry that was still alive. The doctor's voice was light, but his eyes held wonder. My body was a husk, dehydrated for weeks, yet I'd survived. I was totally dehydrated completely for weeks at that point. The machines hummed, the room sterile, but my mind was elsewhere. I remember climbing in the ground and my toes in mud and my hand on ferns. Those sensations, the hill, the grass, felt more real than the hospital bed. I confirmed the actual conversations my friends were having that I observed that day. I told them what I'd heard, the cow with the hole, the hygiene details, and their faces paled. They confirmed that this was actually what they were talking about. I have no explanation for that whatsoever. How could I know their words, their exact location, when I was dying miles away? It was in the location that I saw. The conversation was niche, beyond my knowledge. Agriculture, cows, nothing I'd studied. She was describing how they keep everything hygienic, a random conversation to have with a history and political science major. I'd never heard of such a class, yet I'd heard every word. The hill, the woman, the run. They weren't dreams. They were something else. A journey my body couldn't make, but my soul did. I don't remember reaching the top of the hill or anything. The memory ended at the ferns, my hands grasping, the woman's voice fading, just my hands grabbing at ferns, and that I was wet, like as if I was running up a hill in my home, which is always wet. It's rainforest. The rainforest imagery was strange. Chile's deserts were dry, not lush, yet the hill felt like home. I asked my friends about the woman, describing her face, her likeness to me. They knew no one like that. No relative, no stranger. I searched my family history, wondering if she was an ancestor, a guardian spirit. Nothing fit. But her presence lingered, a puzzle I couldn't solve. The hospital released me, my body healing but my mind restless. The doctors just smiling at me with their faces. Their relief was palpable, but I felt marked, changed by the run. I rejoined my friends, their laughter now tinged with awe. What I heard them talking about was just so mundane, too. The banality of their words, cows, classes, clashed with the profundity of my experience. I kept quiet, afraid to sound mad, but the truth burned in me. I'd left my body, seen the world beyond, and returned with knowledge I shouldn't have. I reiterated this to them, and they confirmed. Their confirmation was my anchor. Proof I hadn't dreamed it. The experience reshaped me. I stopped backpacking, settling in a quiet town, craving stability. The Atacama's vastness, its cruel indifference, haunted my dreams. But so did the hill, the grass, the woman. I ran back up this wet, thick hill. That run was my lifeline, a bridge between life and death. I studied out-of-body experiences, reading accounts of near-death journeys, of souls wandering while bodies lingered. Some spoke of guides, figures who led them back, but none described a woman so like themselves, her voice so tender yet firm. I wondered if she was me, some future self, some echo of my soul. I shared my story with a local healer in Chile, an old woman with eyes like the desert. She listened, nodding, and said the Atacama was a place of thin veils, where the living and the dead brushed close. "You were called back," she said, "by something that knew you." Her words comforted, but didn't explain. I have no explanation for that whatsoever. The mystery remains, a thread connecting me to that hill, that moment. I live now, grateful, but forever changed, carrying the weight of a journey no one else can see. The feeling in my chest I wanted so bad to reach them. That longing, that run, is my truth. A story written in mud and ferns, a life reclaimed from the edge. The unseen trespasser. The house is yours, alone, a sanctuary in the quiet night. But what happens when the silence breaks, when sounds you can't explain creep through the walls? You're a skeptic, dismissing ghost stories as nonsense. Yet, footsteps echo above you. Lights flicker on where you left them off. Something's moving, and it's not you. You search, find nothing, but the air grows heavy. Then, a crash, sharp and sudden. The kitchen lies in chaos. A plate shattered, cupboards flung open. No one's there. This isn't a prank or a trick of the mind. Something unseen walks your halls, defying reason, challenging your disbelief. It's in your home, and it wants you to know. This is the night Liam faced a mystery that shook his world. By the time you hear the end, you'll question what moves in the shadows of your own house. The council estate in northwest England was a patchwork of weathered brick and whispered tales, its streets clinging to the edge of poverty. Liam, a boy raised on skepticism, grew up in one of its terraced houses, where the walls seemed to hold more stories than the people. He grew up in a council estate in northwest England, quite a poor area. The area was rumored to sit on the bones of an old Italian POW camp. Though Liam doubted the local legends of haunted pubs and spectral figures, he believes it was built upon a small Italian POW camp. There were many stories of a black shadow moving through the terrace they lived in as he was growing up. And this was a common story shared between neighbors. His mother, hooked on shows like Most Haunted, saw ghosts in every creek, but Liam rolled his eyes at her fervor. His mom would always be watching paranormal TV shows like Most Haunted, so any notion of Occam's razor was firmly out the window, and he would quickly assume something was a ghost. He's a skeptic. He doesn't really believe in paranormal stuff, but he would still probably refuse to be alone in a haunted place, and he gets uneasy around ghost stuff. The house was ordinary, unremarkable, until it wasn't. A noise, faint but deliberate, pulled Liam from his solitude, setting his nerves alight. One night, left alone while his family attended a school event, Liam sprawled on the couch, the TV's hum a steady comfort. His parents and his younger sister had left for a school performance, and he'd stayed at home. He assumed he was home alone until he heard some noise downstairs. It was a thud, soft but unmistakable, from the kitchen below. He goes and checks it out, and there's nobody there. The rooms were empty, the back door locked. He assumed it was his older sister who could have been home, but a quick call confirmed she was at a party. Turns out, though, that she was at a party. Then, another sound. Footsteps, heavy and measured, pacing the floor above. Then he heard footsteps upstairs. Liam's pulse quickened. He was alone, wasn't he? The house answered with a light that shouldn't be on, glowing from his parents' room. He steps outside into the front garden to check his parents' bedroom window, and their bedroom light was turned on miraculously. He was certain, though, that it was turned off before, as he turned it off himself after they left. He'd switched it off himself before they left. He was sure his sister was at home, so he goes back inside, locks the door, and he goes to check upstairs. Heart thudding. He climbed the stairs. He checks upstairs, and there's nobody there. Nobody hiding anywhere either. Every room was empty. The closets bare. He turns the light back off. He flicked the light off, the darkness returning, until a crash tore through the house. Then he hears a loud crash in the kitchen downstairs. The air turned cold, the house alive with malice. Liam ran, fear clawing at his chest, toward the source of the chaos. He runs down to see what was happening, and he sees a plate on the ground, smashed along with every single cupboard door flung wide open. The kitchen was a wreck. A single plate lay shattered on the floor, its shards glinting under the dim bulb. The cupboard where the plates were was on the left-hand side, raised above the counter, and he thinks it was only a single plate broken. He was that terrified that he didn't dare stick around to find out. Every cupboard door gaped open, as if flung by an unseen hand. He opts to run next door to sit with them until his parents got home. Liam fled, pounding on the neighbor's door, his breath ragged. They didn't really much believe him, and that was really disappointing. They listened, skeptical, their doubt a sting. It was definitely only him in the house at the time, though, and he just can't think of what it could be. The neighbor's warmth couldn't erase the chill. Liam sat, replaying the night, the house's secrets gnawing at his disbelief. There were a few more unexplained things that happened in that house. The estate was rife with tales, lights flickering, shadows darting, objects shifting in the night. They also lived in the house 2 doors down, too, which had even more unexplained stories according to his mom. There were things like black shadow figures, lights turning on and off, and very rarely on occasion things seeming to move. But this night stood apart, a puzzle with no edges. This was by far the strangest incident that had ever happened to him. Liam's skepticism wavered, his mind circling the impossible. From a paranormal standpoint, he's not sure if he will believe it, but he's definitely interested to learn more and potentially uncover some explanation about what it could have been. Always best to keep an open mind with these things, is what he says. The house, the estate, the land. It held something. A presence that defied reason, that left footprints in his memory long after he left. The strange night under Utah's sky. The Utah mountains loomed over a remote cabin, their peaks lost in a starlit sky, where a couple sought peace among friends. They opened the windows, letting the night in, unaware that something else was watching, waiting to reveal itself in the dark, stargazing in the tall grass. They saw lights, too many, too precise, forming a triangle that pulsed with purpose. The sky within it shimmered, a cloaked shape moving, a UFO unveiled, its departure leaving the world silent, the night holding its breath. Back in the cabin, unease lingered, the stars now a warning. A whistle pierced the quiet, high and sharp, a call from nowhere, followed by footsteps, heavy, deliberate, on the deck, their rhythm paired with a guttural breath that wasn't human. They searched. lights blazing, but found nothing. No prints, no trace, despite the rain-soaked earth. The absence was a riddle, the night's events a puzzle, their minds torn between aliens and ancient myths. The truth hidden in the mountain's shadows. The cabin was no longer a haven, its walls too thin, its windows too open. The couple stayed, but the night's strangeness lingered, a question unanswered, a warning that some skies held secrets too vast to comprehend. My friends and I entered a cabin in Hatch, Utah, at the base of some mountains. The cabin was a refuge, nestled high in the rugged Utah wilderness, its wooden walls a promise of escape. We were so high up that the house didn't have AC, so we opened all the windows. The air was crisp, the windows wide, inviting the mountain's breath, a choice we'd later question. We were surrounded by beautiful tall grass, awesome views. It was just perfect. The landscape was a painting, grass swaying, mountains towering, the world vast and serene. We went out at night to stargaze. The sky was a canvas, stars scattered like jewels, calling us to the open field. That's when things started to get a bit weird. The night was alive, its quiet too deep, its stars too bright. My husband and I were out by ourselves after our friends went in, when we saw a ton of what we thought were satellites. The lights were countless, their movement precise, unlike any stars we'd seen. Out of nowhere, they formed into a sort of triangle shape. The formation was deliberate, a geometric dance that held our gaze. Suddenly, the night sky that was inside the triangle started to move with the lights very slowly, almost like something was using a cloaking device to hide what it was. The sky shimmered, a distortion revealing a shape, vast and silent, its edges blurred. We both thought UFO instantly and couldn't believe what we were seeing. The word hung between us, unspoken, our hearts rebutting, the sight too strange to deny. As soon as it appeared, it zipped off, and we didn't see anything else again. Its departure was swift, a streak of light, gone before we could blink. But noticed that all the sound had stopped. The night was mute. No insects, no bats, only silence, heavy and unnatural. What I mean is that there was no sound from bugs, bats, or anything except there were tons of shooting stars and a few what looked like meteors. The sky was alive, its stars falling, their brilliance a stark contrast to the quiet below. As soon as it was gone, we both went inside to tell our friends, because we felt a bit uneasy. Because of this. The cabin's warmth was no comfort. Our friend's skepticism, a thin shield against our fear. I do wish that was it. But we were in our room getting ready for bed when we heard a high-pitched whistle outside. The sound was sharp, cutting through the night, its source unknown. We both sort of laughed at this and joked about skinwalkers and wendigos. The myths were a jest, a way to dismiss the unease, their names a fleeting shield. The cabin felt exposed, its windows a vulnerability, the whistle a prelude to something darker. We climbed into bed, the laughter fading, the night's strangeness pressing closer, its presence a weight we couldn't shake. Then, footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoed on the deck, each thud paired with a deep, guttural breath, a sound no animal could make. Fear gripped us, the cabin's walls too thin, the night too vast, the thing outside too close. I acted, lights blazing, blinds thrown open, shouting to scare it away. But the deck was empty, the rain-soaked wood untouched, no prints, no trace. The absence was a lie, the night's truth hidden, its mystery deepening with each silent second. We stayed awake, the cabin a cage, the mountains a witness, The whistle, the steps, the UFO. Were they linked? A message from beyond, or something older, tied to the land? The stars offered no answers, only questions. The nights that followed were calm, the cabin safe, but the memory lingered, a shadow on the sky, a warning that some places held secrets too strange, too vast, to ever understand. Their truths buried in the Utah night. I don't really believe in that stuff. So again, we laughed it off and we got into bed. The bed was a haven, its blankets a frail defense, our laughter hollow. But not even minutes later, we heard heavy footsteps on the deck outside of the room, and heavy breathing. The steps were thunder, each one a jolt, the breathing deep, animalistic, a presence too real to ignore. I was honestly paralyzed with fear for about seconds while we listened to it stomp heavily with a guttural deep breath. My body froze, my husband's hand tight in mine, the sound a chain around our hearts. I then jumped up and hit the lights outside on the deck and threw open the blinds, yelling, assuming that it was a bear. The light flooded the deck, my voice a roar, expecting a beast, but the deck was empty. But when I did, there was nothing there. The absence was a shock, the night mocking, its silence louder than the steps. It had rained heavily that day, though, and there were no prints on the deck either, or dirt or mud around the house or anything. The rain-soaked wood was pristine, no trace of movement. The mystery a wound in our minds. Now I 100% believe in aliens, but I just cannot blame that second encounter. The UFO was clear, its lights a truth, but the footsteps were a riddle, their source beyond reason. Has anyone else experienced anything like this? Do I need to worry about being followed? The fear was real, the thought of pursuit a shadow, the night's events a question we couldn't answer. Our friends experienced none of this, and I'm honestly just stomped. Their ignorance was a gap, our experience isolating, the cabin a stage for something only we saw. I felt so uneasy the rest of that first night that I didn't sleep. The darkness was a weight, the cabin's walls too fragile, the sky too vast. But after that, nothing else happened for the next nights that we were there, and I felt totally at ease. The calm was a relief, the cabin safe, but the memory lingered, a scar on the night. So I guess my question is, what did I experience? The stars, the steps, the silence. They were pieces of a puzzle, a truth hidden in the Utah mountains, a mystery that followed us home, unanswered, eternal. The unseen hiker. The trail wound upward through the pine forests of Mount Lawu, its sacred slopes cloaked in mist and whispers of the past. My friend stood at the base, his pack heavy, ready to conquer a mountain revered and feared by Java's people. This didn't happen to me, but to a friend who went hiking to Mount Lau in Java, Indonesia. Lawu, a place of pilgrimage and peril, held stories of vanishings and voices in the dark. He climbed with companions, unaware that something or someone would join them, unseen, on a journey that would break him. This is the tale of a hike where the mountain's secrets walked among them. Mount Lawu loomed, its peaks holy, yet haunted, a place where the veil between worlds felt thin. Mount Lau is considered a sacred place by the locals, and people believe it is one of, if not the most haunted mountains in Java. Locals spoke of spirits guarding its paths, of hikers lost forever in its folds. Many people have got lost up there too, and some have never been found. One story lingered. A young boy, Alvin, vanished near a place called Pasar Setan, the Devil's Market. One case in particular, which I recall, is The disappearance of a young boy named Alvin, who went hiking up there with some of his friends and just vanished without a trace. His name echoed in warnings, tied to a grassy clearing where voices drifted without source. He was last seen by other hikers near Padang, the market or Devil's Market, an empty grassler near the top, where many hikers have reported hearing mysterious disembodied voices, hence the name of Pasar Satan. My friend, undeterred, chose to climb with two others he'd met through a hiking group. My friend and two other hikers, they decided to climb the mountain. They picked the Kandi Setho Trail, known for its gentle ascent and stunning views. There are several marked trails by which you get to the top of the mountain. The busiest one is Kandi Cheto, because it is one of the easier trails to pick, and the scenery up there is breathtaking. The trail was kind at first, pines giving way to grasslands under a vast sky. But the ascent, it takes a bit longer. It is a footpath that gradually ascends through pine forests, grasslands, and whatnot. My friend led, his companions new to such heights. He and the two rookie-through hikers took this trail. It was his first climb to the top of the mountain they had met on a hike months before, and decided to take the easier trail since the other two guys had never attempted a mountain of this caliber before. The path was quiet. Only a few hikers scattered about. It wasn't one of those busy days when they arrived, and there were only a handful of other hikers around. Their journey began smoothly, laughter mingling with the crunch of leaves. Their trip went smoothly at first, but as they passed a thicket, two local hikers joined them, their presence welcome. But soon they were joined by two other hikers from a nearby city after they broke through the thicket and passed through Padang. The group moved on, the clearing of Pasar Setan behind them, its name a whisper of unease. My friend felt a shift, a chill beyond the mountain's cold. My friend began to feel a little bit uneasy, and then he noticed something a little off with our hiking group. There were now 6 of them. Somebody else had joined them unnoticed, which was weird. The realization hit like a stone. There were 6, not 5, in their group. He looked around and stared at his fellow hikers one by one, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They all looked familiar to him, which was obviously very confusing. He counted again, his heart racing, but couldn't pinpoint the stranger. He couldn't seem to recognize the odd one out no matter how many times he counted and scrutinized their faces. No one else noticed, their chatter unbroken. And to make it even worse, he seemed to be the only one who had noticed this. Was it exhaustion? The altitude? The cold? He asked himself if he was becoming disoriented due to the exhaustion or the cold, perhaps. Shadows flickered at the trail's edge, blurry shapes darting in the fog, and that was when he started seeing glimpses of blurry silhouettes moving around them. Fear clawed at him. The summit no longer a goal, but a trial. He wanted to quit at this point. He didn't feel excited about this hike. He didn't feel like he was going to make it another hour. Halfway up, turning back meant facing the unknown alone. But there was really nothing that he could do. They were already halfway to the top, and he was sure that he would have had no choice but to return alone. If he decided to turn back anyway, he had lost his bearings too. He had no idea where he was or who he was with. At the summit, he collapsed, his mind unraveling. When they finally reached the top, though, he just collapsed in a heap. He babbled, delirious, of being followed, watched. According to his friends, he then became delirious and started speaking of random creepy things, like when being followed by something and someone watching them in the fog. He begged to be left, speaking of death and love for his family. He even told them to just leave him there because he was going to die anyway, and to let his parents know how much he missed them and loved them. Hours passed before he calmed, strength returning. It took them a few hours to calm him down and for him to regain his strength. They camped, but sleep eluded them, a presence lingering. And then they decided to set up camp for the night, but the other guys also couldn't sleep. That night they said that they could feel a presence with them. Dawn broke, and they fled, dismantling camp in haste. When the first lights of the day appeared in the sky, they quickly dismantled the tents, and they packed away everything and began their descent, which luckily only took a few hours down the slope until they made it safely back to base camp. My friend, feverish, was rushed to a hospital, alive but shaken. My friend had to be rushed to the hospital burning up with fever. He had made it through the night and down the mountain, but others just like him, they weren't so lucky. The sixth hiker was never mentioned again, a ghost in their midst. I wonder if others have met this unseen companion, a shadow on sacred slopes, and what it means for those who climb Lau's haunted paths. I'm wondering, though, if anybody has ever experienced this other hiker phenomenon, or something similar, while climbing a mountain or trekking through the wilderness or something. It's something that I've never really heard anyone else talk about, and it's really creepy. The triangle of blood. The cow's screams stopped, swallowed by silence. But what we found in the field wasn't natural. 3 bloody legs, torn and arranged in a perfect triangle, with no body, no tracks, just a mystery that still claws at me. Blood pooled in the grass, framing a triangle of severed legs. But the cow was gone. No prints, no sound, nothing but the field's quiet, as if it hit a predator we'd never understand. We followed the cries, expecting a birth, but found a slaughter. 3 legs, ripped raw, stood in a triangle. The cow vanished, the field empty, whispering of something we weren't meant to see. The field was our playground, until the screams led us to a triangle of gore. No cow, no tracks, just blood and silence. A riddle that turned our childhood haunt into a nightmare. 3 legs, torn and deliberate, marked the earth in blood. The cow was nowhere, the field too still, and I knew something had taken it, something that left no trace but terror. When I was a teenager, I grew up in a small town called Bark Burnett, Texas. The town was a speck on the map, a cluster of weathered homes and dusty roads nestled along the Red River, its waters marking the line between Texas and Oklahoma. It's a country town on the Red River bordering Oklahoma. Life was slow, the air thick with the scent of earth and livestock, the rhythm of rural days unbroken. My house was located on the outskirts of town, and behind a sagging wooden fence stretched a vast field, its grasses swaying under the endless sky. Behind our fence was a giant field where cattle would graze. The field was alive with the lowing of cows, their calls a familiar hum that wove through our lives. So it wasn't strange to hear them moo throughout the day and night. Me and my siblings were no strangers to this field. It was our domain, a playground of dirt and dreams where we chased each other through the grass. We would play out there and even camp out there every once in a while to get away from our parents. The field offered escape, its open spaces a refuge from chores and rules, our tents glowing under the stars. We were country kids, raised on freedom and the land's raw pulse, unafraid of its shadows. The fence was a threshold, its barbed wire a minor obstacle. The field beyond a world we thought we knew. Our house, with its creaking porch and warm kitchen, stood watch, but the field was where we lived, where we were wild. One day, While my siblings and I were playing basketball outside in the driveway, we started hearing what sounded like a cow giving birth in the distance. The ball bounced against the cracked pavement, our laughter mingling with the summer heat. When the sound cut through, a raw, anguished bellow from the field. It was screaming as if it was in pain. The cry was unlike the usual moos, sharp with distress, a call that demanded attention. So us being the country kids that we were, decided to jump the barbed wire fence and witness the birth firsthand. Curiosity drove us, the thrill of seeing life unfold, pulling us toward the sound. We scrambled over the fence, its barbs snagging our jeans, our sneakers sinking into the field's soft earth. As we made our way, we could tell that we were getting closer by the sound of the cries getting louder. The field stretched before us, its grasses tall, the cries guiding our steps. Each scream was a beacon, drawing us deeper, our excitement tinged with unease. When all of a sudden the cries just stopped, it went dead silent. The silence was abrupt, a void that swallowed the field, the air heavy with absence. Well, we continued to walk in the direction that we last heard the cow. Our steps slowed, the quiet unnerving. But we pressed on, driven by a need to know. The field was familiar, its paths worn by our games. Yet it felt different now, watchful, its grasses hiding secrets. The silence was a warning, the field holding its breath. But we walked on, blind to what waited. When we noticed something about 50 yards away in a clearing, we decided to see what it was. The clearing was a break in the grass, a patch of earth exposed under the sun, something glinting in its center. So we all approached it, and to our surprise, we happened to stumble upon 3 of the cow's legs. The sight was grotesque, a shock that stopped us cold. They looked as if they had been ripped from the cow while it was still alive and strategically placed in a triangle. The legs were raw, their flesh torn, arranged with precision to form a perfect triangle, each point marked by a severed limb. There was a massive amount of blood around the triangle. The blood was fresh, pooling in the dirt, its scent sharp and metallic, staining the earth red. But there was no cow anywhere. The absence was impossible. The cow's body gone. No trace of its bulk or struggle. I mean, where the heck did that cow go? The question hung heavy, a riddle with no answer, the field offering no clues. But we didn't hear any trucks or see any tire marks near the legs or anything. The clearing was pristine, no ruts or tracks to suggest a vehicle or predator. In fact, there were no prints anywhere. The ground was untouched, no paw marks, no hoof prints, just the triangle and its blood. A scene too clean, too deliberate. The whole thing is just a real head-scratcher. The image burned into us, a puzzle that defied reason. Its strangeness, a weight we carried home. The triangle stared back, its blood a silent scream. The cow's fate, a secret the field would never tell. The walk back was quiet, our steps heavy, the field's silence oppressive. We didn't speak, each of us lost in the image of those legs, the blood, the empty clearing. The fence loomed, its barbs a reminder of the world we'd left behind. But the field had changed us, its mystery a shadow we couldn't shake. It's been 25 years, and I still think about this. The memory is vivid, a scar that time hasn't faded. The triangle, a symbol of something beyond understanding. The house was the same, its porch creaking, our parents' voices calling us in. But the field was different, its grasses hiding a truth we'd never uncover. We told no one, the story too strange, too raw, a secret kept among siblings. The field remained, the cows still grazing, their moos a constant. But we never camped there again, our games confined to the driveway. The triangle haunted us, its precision unnatural, its blood a question mark. Was it a prank, a ritual, or something older, tied to the land's bones? No tracks, no cow, no answers, just the clearing and its gore. A moment that marked us, a mystery that lingers, as real now as it was then. The field is still there, but I don't cross the fence, knowing the triangle waits, its blood a whisper of the unknown. The Vanishing Trail. The woods of New Jersey were a sanctuary, their trails weaving through our small town by the Delaware River like veins of a hidden world. My girlfriend and I live in a small town in New Jersey right by the Delaware River. My girlfriend and I, drawn to their quiet beauty, sought a familiar path in a state park. We have many trails around here in the woods, and the one that we went to last night is in a small state park right by the river. We'd walked it before, its clarity etched in memory. We had gone to this spot once before, during winter, and all of the vegetation was gone. But this time, the forest had other plans. What's waiting in the brush? Summer had transformed the trail, cloaking it in dense, suffocating green. This first time the trail was quite clear and had only a very thin strip of wood separating the road from the riverbank. However, this second time it was different now that it was summer. There was thick brush everywhere in that spot. We parked by the road. The trailhead, a narrow invitation. We parked a car in a small space, right out of the road, where all the trail lights start. Its beaten path was oddly pristine amidst the chaos. Thinking back, it was almost unnatural too, how beaten down the narrow slice of trail was, in contrast to the thick brush surrounding it. Why is it so clear? We stepped forward, unaware of the trap. The path led us swiftly to the river, a 6-minute walk past a ditch and a towering tree with roots like claws. In any case, we start on the trail and easily make it to our spot and the river. There was one area where the trail led us to a small ditch filled with plant life. The river roared high, but we found a perch. When we got to our spot, we saw that the river was quite high, but we found a spot to sit down. We lingered, lost in conversation. We sat talking about the tragic fire that recently happened in Hawaii. But as dusk loomed, unease stirred. We need to leave. Now, returning. The ditch felt wrong, its air heavy with dread. When we passed the big tree right at the start of the trail and got down in the ditch, something felt off immediately, though I couldn't tell you exactly what it was. But I felt terrified of the vegetation. The trail was gone, swallowed by the brush. The two of us tried to come back on the same trail that we came through. But when we went in that direction, we noticed that the brush had completely swallowed it up. Panic set in as we searched in vain. We looked everywhere in that ditch for our trail. We even brute forced our way into the direction of the trail, but they never found a trace of it. Where did it go? Darkness fell, and the woods turned hostile, hiding our path and whispering of unseen eyes. At this point, it was completely dark, and we only had our phone flashlights. We ran, thorns tearing at us, lost in a maze that shouldn't exist. We ended up having to brute force our way through the brush to the road, and it took far longer than it should have. It felt like we were running for hours. A noose from a past visit haunted our thoughts, tying us to something restless. You see, she had found a tattered rope on the ground right off to the side of the trail, under a tree. It was unmistakably and tragically a noose. What wants us to stay? Our town in New Jersey was a quiet haven, its proximity to the Delaware River a draw for those seeking nature's embrace. Right by the Delaware River, the state park's trails were our escape. Each path a story of seasons past. We have many trails around here in the woods. Our first visit in winter revealed a stark, open trail. The riverbank just a step away. This first time the trail was quite clear. But summer's arrival painted a different picture. The woods alive with an almost oppressive growth. Now that it was summer, there was thick brush everywhere. The trailhead, a small clearing by the road, beckoned us despite the surrounding chaos. In a small space, right out of the road, the trail's clarity was deceptive. A narrow ribbon cutting through a sea of green. How beaten down the narrow slice of trail was. We moved with purpose, the path guiding us past a ditch overgrown with vines. There was one area where the trail led us to a small ditch filled with plant life. A massive tree, its roots sprawling like ancient hands, marked our progress. We passed a big tree with thick roots coming out from the ground. The river's edge was a reward, its waters high, but inviting. We saw that the river was quite high. We sat, the world fading as we spoke of distant tragedies, talking about the tragic fire. The decision to leave came as the sky darkened, a prudent choice to avoid the night's embrace. We figured it would be a good idea to head back before it got dark. But the ditch, once a minor obstacle, now felt like a trap, its vegetation a living barrier. Something felt off immediately, though I couldn't tell you exactly what it was, but I felt terrified of the vegetation. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the woods themselves resisted our departure. It was so thick and suffocating that I could barely breathe standing in the ditch. The trail's absence was a shock, its path erased. The brush had completely swallowed it up. We searched frantically, our phone flashlights cutting through the gloom. We only had our phone flashlights. Every direction led to more brush. No sign of the clear path we'd taken. No narrow slice of clear ground everywhere was covered in green. A second tree, smaller but familiar, offered false hope. Its path blocked by stinging nettles, coming upon a second smaller tree with its roots above the ground. And here we saw what looked like part of the trail that we were on, but the entire path was completely blocked by stinging nettles. Fear of wildlife, coyotes, bears, gnawed at us. We were scared of the coyote packs and bears that call these woods home. The woods seemed to twist, defying logic. This was not a very large trail by any means. We should have stumbled upon it. My girlfriend's panic mirrored my own. Our maps app useless against the forest's will. My girlfriend was panicking, and I was not much better. We ran, thorns clawing at our skin, the journey endless. It felt like we were running for hours. In fact, we weren't walking too. We were running. Emerging on the road, we were disoriented, far from our entry point. We also ended up farther down the road in the opposite direction of the trail, which honestly should have been impossible. The trailhead was gone, sealed by undisturbed plants. We noticed the trail was totally blocked. No trace of the spot where we entered the plants completely undisturbed. Driving home, my girlfriend's memory of the noose resurfaced, a chilling detail from our first visit. She had found a tattered rope on the ground right off to the side of the trail under a tree. It was unmistakably and tragically a noose. Its weathered state spoke of despair, a relic of someone's final act. It had been cut cleanly on the end that would be tied to the tree. It was very dirty and had clearly been exposed to the elements for some time. Her act of hiding it, though well-intentioned, felt like a mistake. Not wanting anyone walking the trail to have to see that she kicked it to the river, her heart was in the right place, but seemingly a foolish mistake in hindsight. A shiver ran through us, the wood's grip lingering, when she said that both of our bodies shuddered, and I felt momentarily that same anxiety and dread that I felt in the woods. We returned, driven by a need to make amends. Tonight we went back to the trail because my girlfriend wanted to perform a ritual for this spirit, as she wanted to make right with it and bring it peace. She prepared a ritual, setting flowers and a black candle at the blocked trailhead. She brought flowers, placing them on the post, marking the still fully blocked entrance, and lit a black candle, adorning the post with a little bit of melted wax. Her words were a plea for peace, an apology for the noose. She said a few words and explained how we meant no harm, apologizing for kicking the rope in the river. Is it listening? I knew how lonely whoever tied that noose had to be. As she poured wax, I saw it, a shapeless form in the shadows, reaching out. But as she poured this wax, I saw something that honestly, I still doubt, but I feel like it's worth mentioning below the arching plants to the immediate left of the first post. I saw an amorphous blob of some kind. It wasn't a trick of light. Its longing palpable. It did not seem like a trick of the light. As it was dark, we only had one small land in the candle, illuminating the area, and weirdly, it seemed to reach out to her, not in a violent or negative way, but in a longing and desperate manner. She remained calm, the presence fading. She was incredible calm. Though, and upon pouring the wax and stepping away, the presence, or whatever it was, disappeared. We sat by the candle, its flame steady, swaying between us like a silent observer. We sat down in front of the post and kept the candles lit. It was the calmest candle that I'd ever seen. The flame slowly drifted UNF, flickering back and forth between my girlfriend and I, as if looking at us and checking us out. It grew calmer, then turned toward the woods. As we waited longer, the candle would grow calmer finally. The stick of incense that we were burning began to reach its end. The candle flame began to drift slowly away from us and pointed towards the woods. I asked if it was ready to go. "Hey, are you ready to go home yet?" I asked. The flame flickered, then stilled, as if agreeing. The candle flame then began to flicker slightly, swinging side to side, then setting calmly centered as if to say, "Okay, I'm ready." We extinguished the candle, tossing flowers into the river as a final gesture. When the incense finished burning, we blew out the candle and got back in our car. We then tossed our last couple of flowers into the river. Exhaustion and peace washed over us. We both felt tired and relaxed after this whole experience, and my girlfriend says that we made peace with the spirit or whatever. We plan to return, but only in daylight. When the brush is thin, we do want to go back someday, only during the day, and only in fall and winter, when the brush is cleared, and we can't become trapped by it. Have we truly made peace? I feel almost completely certain that they were behind the events of that night, that they wanted us to stay and keep them company. The experience lingers, a question mark in the wood's silence. Feel free to believe or disbelieve as you wish. But quite honestly, I would love to get your thoughts in the comments as to what you think that this was all about. The noose, the vanished trail, the reaching shadow. What were they? Though I don't think that they meant us harm. The Delaware River flows on, carrying our flowers, and perhaps the spirit's story, a tale of loneliness that found us in the brush. What else waits in those woods? The Top Hat Shadow, The hospital's palliative care unit was always quiet at night, but that silence hid something sinister. I started hearing footsteps walking up and down the unit's corridor. I ignored them at first, blaming exhaustion, until a patient screamed about a man in a top hat. Then I saw it on the camera. A shadow, tall and still, with glowing red eyes. It turned towards me, a pair of strange, dark red eyes showing. It wasn't a delusion. It was real, and it was watching me. What did it want? Night shifts in the old hospital were never easy, but that night was different. One of our patients, the one in room number 7, started calling us frantically. He was terrified, cowering, begging me to make the man in a top hat leave. I humored him, but then I saw it. A figure on the surveillance feed, standing outside his door. There was a big shadow standing right in the middle of the frame of the camera. It moved, and I felt its gaze. Was it death itself? The corridor's dim lights flickered as I checked the cameras, my heart racing. The steps, though, kept coming all the way to the nurse's room, stopping about 2 steps away from showing at my door. Nothing was there. Yet a patient screamed about a top-hatted figure. I went to calm him, but the shadow appeared, real and towering, its eyes burning red. It screeched at me and flew into the patient's bedroom. My colleague saw nothing, but I knew. It was no hallucination. I've seen death in the palliative unit, but never like this. I could tell that it was a man tall and strong with a top hat over his head. It stood by a patient's bed, a shadow only I could see, its presence chilling the air. The patient died the next day, and it wasn't the last time. Every single time that I see him, it's under the same circumstances. Each sighting ends the same. A glance, a fade, a death. Is it a warning or a cause? The old hospital's walls seemed to hold secrets. And that night, one revealed itself. I'm not sure if this thing is killing people or announcing their deaths. A shadow in a top hat appeared, first in a patient's delusion, then on my cameras, then before my eyes. I wait for a little bit until he turns to me, and then dissipates, and 1 or 2 days later, the patient always passes away. It's followed me ever since, a specter I can't escape. Why me? I'm a nurse at a palliative care unit in an old hospital. The building was ancient, its brick walls steeped in decades of sorrow and healing. Throughout my years working at this hospital, I've seen a lot, especially being in a palliative care unit. Death was a constant companion, each patient's passing a quiet farewell or a painful struggle. You see a lot of things other people wish they wouldn't. Over time, I learned to accept the weight of it, to carry on despite the grief. But the unit that I worked in has 9 beds and 9 different bedrooms, all spread along a sort of long corridor. The layout was simple but eerie. A long hallway with 9 patient rooms, a lift at one end, and a staircase nearby. At the start of the corridor is the lift, and coming out of it, you'd find the cleaning room on your right, where we keep all the cleaning equipment and products, and the nurse's room on your left. The staircase entrance was opposite, its door always unlocked for safety. The administration forbade us from locking the stairs' doors. This was risky. Delirious patients could wander, endangering themselves or others. So we always keep the doors closed by tying a bed sheet around the door handles, just to keep them together. The nurse's room was our haven during night shifts, a small space for paperwork, rest, or stolen naps. The nurse's room is where we'll spend most of the night shifts doing all-in-sub activities, including resting and actually sleeping. My routine was methodical. Check patients, secure windows and doors, monitor cameras, and review files. My routine would include checking on all our patients, checking on all the doors and windows, and to make sure that they're all locked properly. That night, I'd finished my rounds, the unit quiet under the hum of fluorescent lights. This night in particular, I had finished with my rounds and was checking on all the cameras. My auxiliary nurse, Clara, popped in, yawning. My nursing auxiliary came into the nurse's room. She asked me if anything else was needed. I told her to rest, and she curled up on a cot, facing the wall. I told her that she was fine to go to sleep, so she took her shoes off, laid down with her back to the room, and me facing the wall, and went to sleep. I opened a new patient's file, preparing for their arrival. I was reading a new patient's file who was coming into our unit soon to know what to expect. Then it began. I started hearing footsteps walking up and down the unit's corridor. Soft at first, like someone pacing in slippers. I dismissed them as fatigue, thinking that I must be really tired and that my ears were playing tricks on me. Night shifts often played tricks on the mind. As they persisted, though, I started wondering what was going on. The steps grew clearer, deliberate, moving from the corridor's far end to just outside our door. The steps, though, kept coming all the way to the nurse's room, stopping about 2 steps away from showing at my door. I checked the cameras. Nothing. I took another look at the cameras, but each and every one of the bedroom and corridor feeds seemed completely normal before I could investigate. A scream pierced the silence. One of our patients, the one in room number 7, started calling us frantically. Clara was still asleep, so I stepped into the corridor alone, my flashlight cutting through the dimness. I walked carefully out of the room, peeked out of the room, and looked around. There was nothing there, and the footsteps had stopped. The steps had vanished. I hurried to room 7, where the patient, Mr. Ellis, was pressed against his headboard, eyes wild. He was shouting frantically, huddling against the bed's headboard, with what seemed like renewed energy, shouting at me to tell the man in the top hat, sitting on the chair in the room, to go away. In palliative care, delusions are common, so I played along. We just sort of go along with their delusions to calm them down. I turned to the empty chair, speaking firmly. I turned towards the chair and started to talk to this Manners man in a top hat, telling him that he needed to go, that the visiting hours were done. "You need to leave now, or we'll call security," I said. After this, the patient calmed down, thanked me profusely for sending the man away, and laid back down to rest. Mr. Ellis relaxed, sinking into his pillows, and I left, unsettled but relieved. Back in the nurse's room, my eyes flicked to the cameras, and my heart froze. As I walked back in, my heart stopped, though all I felt was panic gripping my heart inside of me. A figure stood at the corridor's end, right outside room 7. There was a big shadow standing right in the middle of the frame of the camera, recording the end of the corridor right in front of the bedroom that I had just been in. Tall, broad, with a distinct top hat. It was motionless, a void in the grainy feed. I took one step back and leaned backward to check if I could see anything there, but there was nothing. I leaned into the corridor. Empty. I gave the cameras another quick glance, and the shadow was still there, standing terrifyingly still in front of this patient's bedroom door. Then I saw it in person. This time, though, when I turned to look directly at the corridor again, this thing was there. A towering figure, its silhouette sharp against the dim lights, eyes glowing a sickly red. It turned towards me, a pair of strange, dark red eyes showing. Time stopped. My breath caught in my throat. It stood like that for a bit, screeched at me, and flew into the patient's bedroom, slamming the door behind it. A piercing sound filled the air, and it surged into room 7, the door crashing shut. Clara jolted awake, panicked. My nurse jumped awake at the slam of the door and started frantically asking me what was going on. I stammered out what I'd seen, my voice shaking. I told her what I had just seen and what had just happened, and she didn't believe me. She was skeptical, but followed me to room 7. I asked her to come with me to the patient's bedroom. She agreed, starting to become curious. We crept down the corridor, every creak amplifying my fear. We walked slowly through the corridor, passing every door carefully. I was afraid that anything would come flying at us at this point. At the door, I hesitated, then pushed it open. When we got to the bedroom, this thing flew into. I pushed the door without going in to check for any kind of danger. A blast of icy air hit me, unnatural in the controlled climate. Immediately felt a breath of freezing air hit my face. The aircon was on in every room and set to 23 degrees, so this was not normal. The room was still. Mr. Ellis asleep. But there it was, by his bed. A shadow, unmistakably male, tall, with a top hat. There, right by the patient's bed, there was this shadow. I could tell that it was a man, tall and strong with a top hat over his head. I whispered to Clara. "Do you see him?" I asked my auxiliary nurse if she could see him, not expecting a no. However, that's exactly what I got. She saw nothing, her eyes scanning an empty room. The shadow turned, its red eyes locking onto mine. Slowly, the shadow turned towards me again. This time, it didn't scream. This time, it slowly dissipated. It faded, leaving a sudden calm. Immediately, I calmed down. Not only could I not see it anymore, I couldn't feel it either. This sense of calm came over me. Mr. Ellis was unharmed. So we left, my mind reeling. In the end, we left the room and went back to the nurse's room. My colleague went back to sleep. Clara slept, but I couldn't. I didn't rest until I checked the rest of the unit to make sure that everyone was safe. I scoured the cameras, seeing nothing but dreading everything. I couldn't help but stare at the cameras every minute for the rest of the night. The next night, I checked on Mr. Ellis. He was gone. I went inside room 7 to check on the patient. When I came closer, I realized that he had passed away. His death wasn't unexpected, given his condition, but the timing chilled me. This was my first experience with the shadow men in the top hat, but it certainly was not the last, and it is still ongoing. It became a pattern. Only I saw it, always before a death. I'm the only one who can see him apparently from around the unit, which freaks everyone out. The shadow returned, always the same. Every single time that I see him, it's under the same circumstances as well. I walk into a patient's room, and there's this shadow at the feet of their bed. It stood at the foot of a bed, silent, its top hat a stark outline. I wait for a little bit until he turns to me, and then dissipates, and 1 or 2 days later, the patient always passes away. Each time, it turned, met my gaze, and vanished. Within days, the patient was gone. I'm not sure if this thing is killing people or announcing their deaths. Was it a harbinger or something darker? I confided in colleagues, but most dismissed it as stress. Clara, though, listened, her skepticism softening after that night. I searched X for answers, finding stories of nurses seeing figures, reapers, ghosts, omens. None matched the top-hatted man, but the pattern was familiar. A sighting, then death. If you're a nurse in a similar unit, or someone who is, please share this with them and comment what you know about it. I needed to know if others faced this, if it could be stopped. I need to know what this is, how to deal with it, and if anybody else has experienced the same as me. The hospital's age didn't help. Its creaking floors and flickering lights fueled the dread. I started noticing details. The shadow favored certain rooms, those with the staircase nearby. Was it bound to the building, a spirit tied to its past? Or was it drawn to me, for reasons I couldn't grasp? I kept a log, noting each sighting, each death, hoping for a pattern beyond the obvious. There was none, just relentless repetition. The sightings never stopped. I'd enter a room, feel the air shift, and see him, tall, hatted, red-eyed, always watching. This is a real story, and it's something that I have to live with almost every day now. My colleagues grew uneasy around me, whispering about the cursed nurse. I couldn't blame them. Do let me know if you guys want to hear more, and I'll make sure to bring any more. I posted on X, asking for others to feel less alone, but responses were few. If you're dealing with something like this yourself, then please know that you're not. So the only one. I wanted to believe I wasn't alone. I considered transferring, but the patients needed me. Their faces a reminder of why I stayed. I learned to live with the shadow, to nod when it appeared, to brace for the inevitable. Each death hurt, each one a question. Could I have done something? I searched for rituals, prayers, anything to banish it, but nothing worked. The shadow was part of the unit, as much as the beds or the charts. Now I wonder if it's more than a ghost. Is it death's envoy, marking its claim, or something older, feeding on the hospital's grief? I still check X, hoping for answers, for someone who's faced it and survived. I can keep you updated on here too if people are getting and want to know more, that is. The top hat shadow is my burden, a constant in a job of endings. I don't know if I'll ever understand it, but I know I'll never forget it. The creature on the roofs. My great-grandpa fought in World War II. He was a young man, barely out of his youth, thrust into the chaos of battle. He's 103 years old now, and just a few days ago he told me a story that he says was the most horrifying experience that he's had in his life. His voice trembled as he spoke, eyes distant, as if the memory was a wound that never healed. I asked if it was about Japanese soldiers, because those guys were vicious back in the day. He shook his head, his face pale. He told me no, apparently it was something else. What could terrify a man who'd faced war's worst horrors? In 1943, he was stationed in the Philippines, along with others, to hold off the Japanese. The islands were a battleground, dense with jungles and secrets. One day, he and his friend Samuel, who unfortunately passed away decades ago, got separated from their platoon. They were deep in a province, the name long forgotten, surrounded by forests and villages. They were in a province making their way through the forest within the mountain area when they both got lost. The trees loomed, their shadows thick, swallowing their calls for help. Why did the forest feel like it was hiding something? They were looking and calling out for their comrades. Their voices echoed, unanswered, swallowed by the green. They ventured deeper and deeper until they reached the end of the forest. The path ended at a clearing, the world quiet but for their breaths. I did ask him, why didn't you just radio for your platoon? But he told me that they did. But for some unknown reason, the communications were scrambled and unintelligible. Static hissed, words garbled, as if the air itself refused to carry their pleas. What was jamming their signal in the heart of the jungle? They both made it out of the forest, but then they noticed that the sun was about to set. The sky burned orange, the light fading fast. Gigi told Samuel that they needed to set up a camp, and Samuel agreed. They scanned the clearing, desperate for shelter. That's when Gigi noticed something off in the distance. It was a small wooden hut. It stood alone, weathered, its door ajar. They both decided to camp inside of it. They approached, rifles ready, hearts pounding. Why did the hut feel like a trap waiting to spring? They made their way over to the hut. They knocked on the door and checked the place, but there was no sign of people anywhere. The air inside was stale, clothes scattered across the floor, as if abandoned in haste. There were clothes scattered around the place. Gigi says that maybe they fled in a panic. Samuel nodded, his eyes uneasy. They both set up camp and ate dinner. They lit an oil lamp, its flame a frail defense against the dark. Samuel proposed the idea of taking shifts throughout the night to keep a lookout. But what was out there, watching them from the shadows? They both woke each other up and took each place as lookout, while the other person slept. The night was heavy, the forest beyond the hut alive with whispers, crickets, wind, something else. Gigi took the first watch, his rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the dark. The lamp flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls. He shook it off, blaming fatigue. But the unease grew, a weight in his chest. Samuel slept fitfully, muttering in his dreams, as if sensing the same wrongness. When it was Samuel's turn, Gigi tried to rest, but sleep was shallow, broken by the lamp's unsteady glow. While Gigi was sleeping, Samuel abruptly woke him up at one point and told him that he'd spotted movement. Gigi jolted awake, his heart racing. Gigi quickly grabbed his rifle and asked him where. Samuel's face was pale, his voice low. Samuel gave the binoculars to Grandpa and pointed in the direction I saw them. In the field, 300 yards away, Samuel said. Gigi peered through, his breath shallow. At first he didn't see anything, but then he spotted something moving in the dark. A shape shifted in the field, low and deliberate. When Gigi looked closer, it was just a wild boar. Relief washed over him, but it was fleeting. "It's just a pig," Grandpa told Samuel. Samuel took the binoculars to see for himself, his brow furrowed. "Huh, that's weird. It's just standing there," Samuel said. Gigi glanced at him, confused. Grandpa looked at Samuel in confusion and asked what he meant. Samuel's voice tightened. The boar wasn't moving or anything. It was just standing there, staring at them from afar, and that it was starting to weird him out a bit. Samuel said. Gigi laughed, trying to ease the tension. Grandpa just laughed it off and told Samuel that it was probably just his mind playing tricks on him. But the boar's stillness gnawed at them, its gaze too steady, too knowing. The oil lamp that served as their source of light inside the hut started to slowly go out. The flame dimmed, shadows creeping closer. Grandpa went over to light it back up. He checked the wick, the oil, plenty left. Afterward went back to his sleeping bag, but then the light suddenly went out again. A chill ran through him, the dark thicker now. Gigi checked up on it again, thinking that the oil probably went out. But the reservoir was full, the wick untouched. The strange thing was that there was still plenty of oil. He relit it, his hands unsteady. He lit it back up again and went back to sleep. But then the flame went out yet again. That's when a terrified Samuel frantically went up to him and said, "It's gone." Gigi's pulse spiked. "What are you talking about?" Gigi asked him. Samuel's eyes were wide, his voice trembling. The pig had just disappeared into, like, thin air. Samuel said. He explained, His words rushed, that the boar had vanished mid-gaze, as if it had never been. Samuel said that he was watching the boar through the binoculars when it suddenly just vanished out of existence. Gigi's laughter died, replaced by a creeping dread. Suddenly, as they were talking, a loud thud came from above them, as if something landed on the roof. The hut shook, dust falling from the ceiling. Something was up there. Gigi and Samuel grabbed their rifles. Samuel's face was ashen, his hands shaking. "We need to get out of here," Samuel said. But Gigi held firm, his training kicking in. Gigi told Samuel not to panic, to lay low, and to stay quiet. They crouched, rifles aimed at the ceiling, breaths shallow. They did while tightly gripping their guns' cloth after a few minutes of silence. The silence was suffocating, each creak of the hut amplifying their fear. Samuel started screaming, though. Gigi spun, his flashlight beam slicing the dark. Grandpa turned on his light, and he said that he saw something that he'll never forget. Something straight out of a horror movie. Something that looked like a tongue that was lodged into Samuel's neck. A long, glistening tendril pierced Samuel's skin, blood welling around it. His friend was screaming in pain, trying to remove it from his neck. Gigi froze, shock locking his limbs. Gigi snapped out of his shock and shot at the ceiling multiple times, trying to hit whatever the tongue belonged to. The rifle roared, wood splintering above. After a few more shots, the tongue released to Samuel and slowly retracted back into the hole in the ceiling. Samuel collapsed, clutching his neck, blood seeping through his fingers. Samuel was gripping the side of his neck tightly, while screaming blood trickling down his neck now. Grandpa put a cloth against the wound and told him to keep pressure on it. He worked fast, tying the cloth tight. Afterwards, they collected all their things, exited the cabin, and made a break for it. They stumbled into the night, the forest a maze of shadows. Grandpa turned around and shined his light on the hut's roof. What he saw stopped him cold. What he saw, he described, is the most evil-looking and ugliest thing that he's ever seen. A creature perched there, humanoid, but wrong. Its form a nightmare carved from darkness. It was humanoid. It had 2 gigantic wings that were bigger than its own body. The wings looked like a combination of a bat's and a hawk's. Its eyes were blood red and glowed in the dark. Its skin was black as coal, hair wild and matted, fangs gleaming even with its mouth closed, skin as black as coal, wild unkempt hair, and huge fangs that were visible even though its mouth was closed. Gigi's breath caught, his mind reeling. Grandpa acted quickly. He raised his rifle and began shooting at the thing, unloading all the rounds in the gun's chamber. The shots rang out, deafening, but the creature didn't flinch. Samuel also did the same thing, but to their astonishment, the monster was unfazed. It stared, unblinking, its gaze a weight that crushed their courage. It just continued to stare at them unbothered. At that point, Gramps and Samuel started screaming like maniacs while running for the hills. They ran, branches snapping underfoot, their screams echoing. By some miracle, the creature didn't pursue them. The forest swallowed them, their flashlights barely cutting through the dark. They were both so scared that they didn't care if they run into the enemy, as long as they didn't encounter this thing again. Hours passed, their lungs burning, until dawn broke. They managed to make it till morning and came across a small village where they rested. The villagers were kind, offering water and shelter. They learned from one of the locals that what attacked them was apparently called an aswang, and that they were very common in the countryside. The locals told them that they were all in God's favor because they survived. The word aswang chilled Gigi. a name that carried the weight of centuries of fear. After a couple of days, they were eventually reunited with their platoon. They told their story, their voices shaky, but only a few believed them, while the others thought that they were probably drunk and ran into the enemy gunfire, hence the injury on Samuel's neck. The disbelief stung. But Gigi and Samuel knew the truth. After the war ended, they all went home, but he could never forget that horrifying encounter that gave him severe PTSD to this day. Nightmares plagued Gigi, the creature's red eyes burning in his dreams. Samuel unfortunately passed away in his 80s due to a stroke. I just spent the past hour Googling aswangs. The stories were chilling. Shapeshifters, bloodsuckers, creatures of Filipino folklore that haunted the night. I really don't know what to believe, but his story honestly freaked me out. Gigi's tale wasn't just a war story. It was a descent into a world where myths were real, where the jungle hid terrors worse than any enemy. I visited him again, his hands trembling as he spoke. The aswang, he said, wasn't just a monster. It was a warning, a reminder of the unseen forces that lurk in the dark. I researched more, finding accounts of aswangs in Visayan lore, creatures that preyed on the vulnerable, their wings silent, their hunger endless. The villagers' words echoed. They were all in God's favor. But Gigi's nightmares told a different story, one of a man marked by a creature that didn't need to chase to claim its prey. The war ended, but Gigi's battle didn't. He returned home, built a life, but the aswang followed, a shadow in his mind. It gave him severe PTSD to this day. Family gatherings were quiet for him, his eyes often distant, seeing a jungle others couldn't. I asked him once why he never told the story before. "Who'd believe me?" he said, his voice soft. Even I doubted it. But Samuel screams. That thing's eyes, they're real. I found books on Philippine folklore, like Maximo Ramos's The Aswang Complex, detailing creatures like the manananggal, with wings and tongues that pierced the night. The locals' belief in aswangs, their rituals with garlic and holy water, felt alive, urgent. I spoke to a Filipino friend, whose grandmother grew up in Capiz, a province famed for aswang tales. She nodded, unsurprised. "They're real to us," she said. "Not just stories. They explain what we can't." She told me of her Lola's warnings. Never sleep near open windows. Never ignore a strange sound. Gigi's story fit, a piece in a larger puzzle of a culture where the line between myth and reality blurred. Do you think it's possible, or do you think it's all just made up? I don't know. But Gigi's fear, his clarity after decades, felt too raw to be fiction. The aswang, whatever it was, had left its mark, not just on his mind, but on me. A story that lingered like the thud on that roof, a warning from a war that never truly ended. The whispering presence. Your family is your anchor, your blood a bond. But what happens when something else claims you? A presence that's watched you since birth. Whispering your name? You're a child, innocent, unaware. A figure hovers, beautiful yet wrong, begging you to follow. It fades, but it never leaves. Not you, not your kin. Years pass, and it's back, sitting on your bed, breathing on your skin, speaking in the dark. It knows you, follows you, crosses states and homes. It's not alone. This isn't a ghost story. It's a legacy, a shadow woven into your family's soul. It's patient, persistent, and it's chosen you. But why? This is the tale of Nora and her twin, bound by a force older than memory. By the time you hear the end, you'll wonder what watches your own family. The house was a patchwork of creaks and echoes, its walls steeped in the weight of years. Nora and her twin brother, Caleb, grew up under its roof, their lives entwined with something unseen. When her father was a child, he told her about when he would lie in bed, that a beautiful woman would float above him asking or begging him to come with her. Her father's childhood was marked by a spectral visitor, radiant at first, her voice a siren's call. As the nights went on, she would get uglier, though still she begged him to leave with her. The woman's beauty decayed, her pleas desperate. As he grew older, and he grew more occupied with school and work, she seemed to visit him less often. Life's demands dulled her presence, but she never truly left. Nora felt it too, a legacy of whispers that clung to her bloodline. As children, the air around them shimmered with secrets. When she and her twin were babies, her elder sister is playing with them. She sees orbs around them and calls for their dad to check it out. Their older sister, eyes wide, pointed to glowing orbs dancing around the twins. The orbs suddenly disappear, though. The lights vanished when their father approached, leaving only questions. The house changed, but the presence didn't. In a different house, she and her twin are teenagers. She has her own bedroom at this point. Nora's room became a stage for the unseen. The night was her visitor's domain. A weight settled on her bed, a touch cold and deliberate, urging her to wake. There were many nights that someone would sit on her bed and lay their hand on her shoulder, whispering to her, "Please open your eyes." The voice was soft, insistent, chilling her skin. She would see a figure in the corner of her room, and it would always freak her out. A shape lingered in the shadows, featureless but watching. Nora's heart raced, but sleep was her only escape. The presence followed, relentless, crossing state lines. She lives in a different state. Her twin still lives with mom and dad in a new house. Caleb stayed behind, tethered to the family home, where the air grew thick with menace. The new house was no sanctuary. It was a cage, alive with footsteps and breaths that weren't theirs. The dogs will not go down a specific hallway. One dog will cry at night randomly. The dogs shunned one hallway, their whines piercing the night. There are knocks on the bedroom window. Someone is walking in the attic, walking in the hallway. Knocks rattled the windows. Steps echoed above. Her twin brother says that it talks to him constantly. It also breathes on him. It sits on his bed, even sits in the car with him. Caleb bore the brunt, the entity's voice a constant murmur, its breath hot on his neck. He once asked how long you've been around, and it replies, "Since you were babies." Her brother says that he's sure that there's at least two of them, the main one having followed them around all their lives. Two presences, one dominant, had claimed them from infancy, their intent a mystery that chilled Nora's soul. The shadow that watched. The house was quiet, its corners dark, but he never felt alone. A man lived with shadows, their fleeting forms a lifelong companion, but none were like her. A woman with gray hair and pale skin, her gaze a weight that burned through his solitude. She came when his world cracked, his heart raw from loss, his mind a maze of doubt. At work, in the dim restroom, her eyes pierced through a cubicle gap, a fleeting glimpse that chilled his blood, her presence a whisper he couldn't shake. She followed him, her form always half hidden, peering from doorways, her stare relentless. At home, at work, in crowded streets. She watched, a silent observer, her intent unclear, her existence a riddle that grew with each sighting. The night his mother fell, the shadow changed, stepping into full view, her dread a force that froze his soul. She stood in his room, unmoving, her gaze a warning, the house a stage for a truth he wasn't ready to face. She was gone when he moved, her presence a memory, but her eyes haunted his dreams, a reminder that some shadows never leave, their watch eternal, their purpose a mystery ours in the dark. Most of my life I've seen things, whether it's the shadows out of the corner of my eye, or just as I'm drifting to sleep, or felt the presence of something that I can't see. The world was never empty, its edges alive with flickers, whispers in the quiet moments before sleep. I've been grabbed, shoved, and even heard whispers, touches in the dark, voices without form. They were my childhood. A strange normalcy I learned to ignore. None of that, though, compares to my frequent visitor. She was different, her presence sharper, her intent a weight that pressed against my life, unyielding and real. I was in a bit of a bad place mentally. I spent a lot of time alone and in my own head, and this seems to be when the problem started. My world had unraveled, a broken relationship leaving me adrift, my thoughts a storm I couldn't calm. I was at my workplace at the time using the urinal, and for some reason I just felt like someone was watching me like a burning stare. The restroom was cold, its tiles echoing, but the air was heavy, a gaze boring into my back. I quickly glanced over my shoulder, and in the gap between the cubicle I could have swore that I saw for a brief moment something there, a figure, fleeting, its form a blur, but unmistakable. It appeared to be some sort of disheveled woman, but just as quickly as I saw it, it disappeared. Her hair was gray, matted, her skin pale, a glimpse that vanished before I could focus. I chalked this up to sleep deprivation, didn't really think anything of it, so I just cleaned myself up and I got back to work. The explanation was easy, my mind tired, but the feeling lingered, a seed of doubt, and boy, do I wish that this was where it ended. The restroom was just the beginning, her shadow a constant, her gaze a chain I couldn't break. Throughout the next few weeks when I was by myself, I never really felt like I was by myself. Solitude was a lie, her presence a hum in the air, always there, always watching. That was when I caught her too. I was sat at my computer one evening, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw that same woman peering at me around the corner of the door. Her form was half hidden, her eyes sharp, a silent observer in my home. As much as I try to remember, I've never been able to really recall her face, though I remember dirty gray hair and somewhat pale skin. But that's basically it. Her features were a blur, her face a void, only her hair and skin clear in my mind. She was a specter, her presence a shadow that clung to my life, her gaze a mirror to my fears. I froze each time, my breath caught, her stillness a challenge, her purpose a mystery that grew with each fleeting sight. At work, she lingered, her eyes in the corners, her form a flicker in empty halls. At home, she watched, her shadow a guest in my solitude, her silence louder than any sound, her intent a weight I couldn't name. In public, she followed, a face in the crowd, always at the edge, always peering. She wanted me to see her, to know she was there. Her watch relentless, her presence a thread woven into my days, unyielding and cold. The night my mother fell, the house turned, its air thick with dread. I woke, a wrongness in my bones, and found her collapsed, her breath shallow, her fear a call. The shadow waited, her form no longer hidden, her dread a force that changed everything. She stood in my room, her eyes a void, her stillness a warning. The house was hers, its walls alive with her will, and I was hers, bound by her gaze, a man marked by a shadow that would never let go. I froze up. I don't know how long I sat there staring back at her, and I don't remember her leaving either. Time blurred, her gaze a trap, my body locked in fear, her departure a blank in my memory. This persisted. I saw her at home. I saw her at work. I even saw her in public once. Her reach was vast, her presence a constant. No place safe from her watch. She was never in full view. She was always peering around a corner like she just wanted to observe what I was doing, but peering enough that she wanted me to know that she was there. Her half-hidden form was deliberate, a game of shadows. Her intent both distant and intimate. My mother fell unwell and had to be rushed to hospital. The night was heavy, its air wrong, a warning I couldn't place. I woke up feeling that something was just wrong. I couldn't put my finger on what was up. But suddenly, I hear from the hall. My mother's door burst open and she's calling to me. Her voice was a cry, her collapse a shock, her body limp on the floor. She's passed out on the floor, semi-conscious and breathing heavily. Her breath was ragged, her eyes wide with fear, her voice a plea. After helping her up, I called an ambulance for her and sat with her. My hands shook, her weight a burden, the phone a lifeline. She asked me not to leave her as she felt in danger. Her fear was mine, her side my place, her danger a truth I couldn't deny. I didn't leave her side until the paramedics arrived. Their arrival was a relief, their voices calm, their purpose clear. Eventually they came agreed that my mother needed to go to the hospital, and I said that I would follow them in my car. The decision was quick, my mind racing, the night a blur of fear. I ran back upstairs to get changed, as I'd just thrown on some comfy clothes, and that was when I saw her. The stairs creaked, my heart pounded, the house too quiet, too still. I rounded the corner of my bedroom, and in full view on the other side of the room was this thing. She was there, no longer hidden, her form stark against the dark. It was standing in full view. I still cannot really recall its face, just the gray hair and pale skin, but I have never felt such dread. Her presence was a void, her gaze a blade. Dread, a tide that drowned me. I kept my eyes locked on it as I grabbed my clothes from my floor. I was wearing the previous day and just backed out of the room while keeping my gaze locked on it. My movements were slow, my eyes fixed, her stillness a threat, her form unmoving. I was half expecting something like out of a horror movie for it to just start sprinting at me with its arms outstretched, but nothing. She didn't move, her silence worse, her gaze a chain. It just stood there still, where it was. Even when I was walking downstairs from where my room was in full view, it was still stood there. Her form lingered, a statue in the dark, watching as I fled. When I came back home later, it was gone. The house was empty, her presence faded, but the fear remained, a scar on my soul. I slept downstairs for weeks after that. The bedroom was hers, its air too heavy, my sleep a refuge in the living room's light. From that point on, I still saw it peering around the corner a lot, but never in full view like before. She retreated to the shadows, her watch quieter, but never gone. Since then, I've had no more experiences with either that thing peering around the corner or anything else. The move was a break, her presence severed, the house a memory I left behind. I do have nightmares about it occasionally, which is probably understandable, right? But really, there's been nothing else, which I'm very grateful for. The dreams were echoes, her eyes a ghost, but the silence was a gift, her shadow a past I escaped, but never forgot. The hand from the ceiling. The house was ours. A fresh start with creaking floors and walls that promised a future together. I moved in with my fiancé, our boxes barely unpacked, dreaming of a life we'd build. We moved into our place with my fiancé. I never noticed anything weird, but my fiancé did. At first, it was just a home, but he saw shadows where I saw light. Now, something stirs in the dark, reaching from places we can't escape, and I'm starting to believe him. This is the story of a house that wasn't empty, and a hand that changed everything. Our new home felt like a victory, a place to call our own, despite its quirks. Some brief background before I begin. The floors groaned, the pipes rattled, but I saw charm where my fiancé saw unease. Now it's escalating, and honestly, I feel bad about dismissing his concerns. Also, we cannot afford to move. He mentioned oddities early on. Small things I brushed off. It started with his contact lens container. He has one that vibrates to move the lenses and the liquid around to clean them. His lens case, a fancy vibrating model, was his pride. I don't have contact, so I may be wrong there, or whatever. But either way, it vibrates for some reason. One night, he came to me, pale, claiming the house was haunted. Anyway, he comes to me and says, "I think that this place is haunted." I ask him why he says that, and he says that something has been messing with his contact lenses stuff. The case had buzzed on its own, the cleaner bottle misplaced. He says that when he went to the bathroom that night, the case began to vibrate by itself on the ledge. Also, the bottle of cleaner wasn't where he left it. I laughed, blaming a faulty switch or a bumped shelf. I tell him that it probably malfunctioned, or he hadn't properly switched it off or whatever, so him closing the bathroom door jangled the shelf enough to turn it back on. He let it go, and I forgot it. I didn't dwell too much on it, and he didn't bring it up again. The incidents grew harder to ignore, creeping into my own routines. Now I have an iPhone, and so I have to manually put my phone on and off silent mode. I never put my phone on silent as there are calls that I can't miss. My phone was my lifeline, always on for my elderly parents nearby. I'm also the only relative that lives near to my elderly parents, and if there's an emergency, I need to know about it. ASAP points being, my phone is never ever on silent. Yet twice in a week, it silenced itself overnight, costing me missed calls. But twice now, in the span of a single week, it's been put on silent mode overnight, and I've missed calls the next day because of it. Neither times, though, was it done by me. I questioned my fiancé, but he swore he hadn't touched it. I asked my fiancé if he had done it, and he said no, but he knows the situation, and he just wouldn't do that anyway. The house felt less ours, its corners hiding secrets. Fast forward to last night. The night it all changed. Fast forward to last night, my fiancé is sick, and he's tossing and turning in bed. He was feverish, restless, keeping me awake. I stay awake mostly to keep an eye on him, and also because he's moving around too much for me to sleep. I watched him. The TV's dim glow my only light. I kept the TV on with the brightness down, but it's enough for me to see the room. Exhaustion tugged, my eyes closing briefly. And at some point I closed my eyes for a while, but then I'm sort of jolted awake. A shape loomed above. A hand, dark and wrong, reaching from the ceiling. But above my bed, I see a thing coming from the ceiling. Not an entire entity, but sort of a large, darkly colored hand with more than 5 fingers on it. It had too many fingers, twisting unnaturally, fading as I stared. I wasn't in a position to count them, but there were definitely more than 5 upon looking at it. The hand thing disappears back into the ceiling in a weird, fading kind of way. I rolled out, fumbling for the lamp, its light banishing nothing. I rolled out of bed, switched my lamp on, and I haven't gone back to sleep since. I sat with tea, guarding my fiancé. The house alive around us. Mostly I've just been sitting in bed with a cup of tea to keep an eye on my fiancé while he sleeps. The roof creaked nightly, no longer just animals. There's some weird stuff going on in this house, and I really don't know what to do about it. Also, I should probably mention that we regularly hear things walking on the roof at night. I always put it down to it just being an animal, while my fiancé always felt differently about it. Now, I'm not so sure. Trapped in a home that watches us back. Now I'm really not so sure anymore. Thank you for listening till the end. Tomás, if you hear a knock at 3 a.m. tonight, don't answer it. Maybe the next story is coming. Symbiotes for you. See you the Sympodas in your next nightmare.